It was spring of 2003. The grass was just getting green and the leaves were about to turn out. I was about 15 and my older cousin was 16. We were playing video games one night when all of a sudden we heard a big bang just outside of our window when it was open. Well, we thought it was just girls playing pranks on us, so we just ignored it at first. 5 minutes went by until we heard another bang, but only it was louder. So we thought, damn, these girls. We decided, okay, we'll give them our attention. We looked outside, but all we could see were the dark figures of trees being blown around in my uncle's abandoned house. We were a bit spooked, so we decided to close the window. Maybe 15 to 20 minutes went by, still in front of the video games, when we heard it again, but it wasn't as loud as the first two. We had had enough, so we paused our game, grabbed our flashlights and said, whoever is pulling this on us is going to get it. My cousin and I made our way outside and thought we'd split up and go around the house and find the person or people responsible for the noises and scare them. We had dark clothing to camouflage into the night and had each end of the house covered. My cousin had the front end and I had the back end, both facing our room window side. There we were waiting for the culprit when all of a sudden we heard that banging sound, but only it was repeating over and over. It sounded like a hammer. We both met each other at the window side and looked around, wondering where it was coming from. As the sound was fading, we looked towards my uncle's house and saw a shadow figure in the window. We thought it was that person who was trying to scare us. We made our way through the door quietly, and again, the sound of a hammer rapidly hitting the wall was coming from one of the rooms. The sound made us jump, but whoever was in that room was going to get the total scare down. As we were walking down the hall trying not to laugh, we decided to wait for the sound to stop and jump inside the room screaming, thinking it would scare this person. Sure enough, the sound stops in a couple of seconds. My cousin and I counted back from 3, 2, 1, and then we said, we got you. We looked around with our flashlights, and there was no one in sight. Just as we were about to freak out, we saw the closet door close, and thought that the person heard us and ran in the closet. I acted like I was heading out the door, and then my cousin grabbed the handles of the closet door and opened it. There was only an old garbage bag filled with garbage. We inspected the whole house, and there was nothing but broken boards and broken glass everywhere, until we saw a tall figure standing at the end of the hallway, looking like it was holding something, maybe a hammer. But we were so scared that we didn't shine our flashlights on it. We just ran out of the house screaming. Now, my uncle's house has been newly renovated. His oldest son and family lives at that house, and so far, I've only been there once. Thanks for reading. My husband and I moved into the house about 4.5 years ago. Nothing happened right at first until about 6 to 7 months later. One night, my husband came to bed and I had awoke to go to the restroom. As I was in there, I heard this man's voice. It sounded like it was coming from the radio. So I went over to check it and the radio was off. I unplugged it anyway and still could hear the voice. I walked into the hallway thinking it was coming from one of our kids' room. I looked into each room to find nothing. Everything was shut off. I looked in the living room at the stereo and TV. They were also off. I went back into the bathroom where the noise seemed to be the loudest, and it was still there. I went back to bed and it finally stopped. My husband also told me that he had heard that same voice many times himself. My husband usually got home from work around 11 p.m., and he would go get on the computer for a little bit before coming to bed. One night around this time, I was about 8 months pregnant, and I was sound asleep. He came running in the room and freaking out, telling me to call 911. Someone's trying to break in our home, he said. He was on the computer when he heard a big crash on the side of our house where the garage cans were. He said it sounded like someone threw the metal garbage can against the fence. He jumped up and then heard footsteps on our porch. He looked towards the door and saw the door handle jiggle back and forth like someone was trying to get in. That's when he woke me up. The police came with search dogs and found nothing, no footprints or anything. My husband also said that whenever he was on the computer at night, he would hear footsteps in the kitchen and rustling around like one of the kids were looking up in the cupboards for something to eat. When he would go to check, nobody was there. He also said he always felt that he was never alone. Another time all the kids were in school, and I was doing laundry and my husband was in the living room watching TV. Well, our two oldest kids had shared a room at the time, which was right across from our room. They had a kid's door alarm on the outside of it. I was coming out of our room, walking towards the living room, when the alarm went off. I was nowhere near it. I looked at my husband and said, "Did one of the kids stay home from school?" My husband always took them to school in the morning. He said just no. Then he got up, and that's when we heard rustling around and something fell over. I grabbed our youngest daughter at that time and went outside. We thought someone broke in. I took the keys to the car and grabbed the phone. My husband came outside as well, but decided to open the gate to the backyard to check out the windows to see if someone had crawled in. That's when we both saw the blinds slowly go up, like someone was peeking out. Then they slowly went down. Of course, we called the police, and they found nothing again. I remember when I would have had a friend come over or something, they always said our place had a weird feeling, and a musty smell. We could smell that too, but just thought it was because the place was kind of old. We moved out about 2 years ago, and are much more at peace. Thanks for reading. I live with my mother in a rather rural area. Our house was built by our landlord and was built in a lot that originally held a small gas station. I don't know much about the history of this area or our home beyond that. Anyway, my mother started to complain that she was smelling an extremely foul odor in the house in late February 2009. She only ever smells it in our house, nowhere else. She describes the odor as stinking like rotting flesh and blood, and she says it's been very strong throughout the house, especially in the hallway and bathroom areas. I've never smelled anything like that, what she has described, and none of our guests in the last few months have either. Since Sunday, April 12th, she has claimed that the scent is now moving. It becomes fainter throughout the house, and at times, she doesn't smell it at all. We both started seeing shadowy moving figures in the corner of our eyes randomly that night. Yesterday, April 13th, she went into the bathroom to take a shower and get ready for work, and didn't smell the odor. As soon as she got out of the shower, she suddenly smelled it and felt as if someone was in the room with her. She immediately told it to leave the bathroom. The scent suddenly disappeared. 2 minutes later, the smell returned to the bathroom. She again said, "Get out," and the odor left, leaving behind a smell akin to dryer sheets, even though we don't use dryer sheets. 5 minutes later, the foul odor returned yet again, and she yelled at it, and it left for the rest of the night. Around 10 p.m. that night, I started hearing a scratching noise in the kitchen, which is attached to the living room where I was. I then heard a strange meow. It sounded unnatural, almost as though it was a human making the meow sound and not a cat. I at first told myself, it's just one of my cats, and I have two, but they were both in the living room with me and were staring into the kitchen with wide eyes, so I'm not exactly sure what the meow was from. I then started hearing a light thumping noise, as if some light object was falling on the floor, coming from our back storage room, which is right off the hallway. I investigated and found a few of my candles on the floor. They had been on top of the dresser back there. The storage room door was closed at the time of the noise, and no one was in there. I sat back down in the living room and saw another moving shadow out of the corner of my eye, this time in the living room. Mom returned from work at 7 a.m. today, April 13th, 2009, and claimed she didn't smell anything unusual. After settling in on the couch, she suddenly claimed to smell the foul odor stronger than ever. I left the room. I had to use the bathroom, and when I returned to the living room, my mother laughed at me and said, "Very funny." She then went on to tell me that she heard a creepy meow coming from the hallway when I was in the bathroom, and she thought I had made the noise. She said it sounded like a girlish voice saying meow. I assured her I didn't make the noise, and I told her about the similar sound I heard in the kitchen last night. Both cats were in the living room napping at the time she heard the noise, and I didn't hear it that time, despite being only 3 feet away from where she said the sound came from. The only things I've noticed is that certain rooms randomly become quite cold, and then warm up momentarily, only to get cold again. I also keep getting the creepy feeling that I'm being watched at times, and it doesn't help when my cats look behind me with wide eyes. My cats have not reacted aggressively, but I've noticed that my younger cat is quite jumpy lately. We moved into this place in April 2007. Beyond feeling randomly uneasy at random times, I've never experienced anything here until recently. Mom has never experienced anything like this until February 2009. Between late February and April 11th, the smell was just a constant odor, as it followed her around the house. Just within the past few days, the odor has begun moving about the house randomly, and we started seeing shadows out of the corner of our eyes and hearing weird noises. My mother, being her, thinks this is all quite awesome. She's always been rather interested in the paranormal, but has never experienced anything until now. I, on the other hand, am rather creeped out and want to resolve this issue as soon as possible. Any ideas on what could be going on? Why now? What can we do? Anything at all would be appreciated. We haven't changed anything or moved anything around in the house, or done anything that could have woken up a spirit of any kind. I'm assuming it's a spirit because of everything that's happening. I'm a little afraid of its sudden active behavior as well. It was okay when it was just an odor only Mom could smell, but now that we're both seeing and hearing things, I'm a bit concerned. I should also mention that when my mother checked out the back storage room this morning, she said the air felt heavy and she had a hard time breathing in there. She immediately left the room. I went in there a few minutes later and it was very cold, but I didn't feel that the air was heavy and I was breathing fine. I do know that the previous renters of this house owned a cat who died of kidney failure in the room now we use for storage. I'd be the first one to blame the weird activity on a ghost cat. Ghost cats seem a lot less scary than unknown creepy, meowing non-ghost cats, but the meow was really non-feline in nature at all, and the shadows that we've seen seem to be tall and human in stature. That's what really throws me off. Again, any help will be very appreciated. And oh, we're not religious people. She's agnostic and I'm atheist, so calling a clergyman probably won't help us out too much. Before I moved to Vegas, I lived in a small town in Connecticut. My family moved into a brand new house in 1992. I was about 3, and I had a new little brother. I don't remember anything for the first few years because I was so young. I had my first encounter that I can remember when I was about 7. I was sitting in bed with the babysitter reading a book. As we sat on the bed, the mattress bounced as if someone was underneath. My babysitter flipped out and took me out of the room. The next thing I remember is waking up one night and looking over next to my bed. There was something that looked like a black figure of a small animal looking at me and then ran out of the door into my brother's room. The next thing I remember is waking up one night and looking over next to my bed. There was something that looked like a black figure of a small animal looking at me and then ran out of the door into my brother's room. I screamed and my parents came in. I told them what had happened and they said it was a dream. But a few nights later, I woke up again to look over at my desk and see the image of a man sitting on top laughing. I didn't bother to tell my family because they wouldn't believe me. Another time I went to bring the dog in from outside. There was a door from the garage to the backyard that the dog used. I opened the door from the house to the garage to find a tall, blacked out figure standing right next to my dog. I freaked out and let the dog in. I told my mom, and she said a little while ago she had seen the same thing. There was also once a time when I had a friend see the man's figure as well when she was spending the night. The thing that freaked me out the most was when my youngest sister was born. She ended up in my old room and I was in another. One night, I was babysitting her with a friend and my sister was in bed. The baby monitor was on and I could hear her cooing, which was weird because she only cooed at people. I went to check on her and she was laying on her back with her hands in the air, towards the ceiling, just staring and cooing. Then her hands and her eyes almost followed something to the closet door, and then she stopped and just looked at me. A lot of other things happened in that house: noises, footsteps, and misplaced objects. We also had a motion sensor security system that would randomly go off in the middle of the night. It happened so often my dad stopped setting the alarm. Some people don't believe me and think I make all this up, but it all really has happened. It was great to log on to this website and read other encounters that sound just like mine, because I know I'm not crazy. Thank you for reading. Seriously, I really appreciate it. I was very young, maybe about 7 years old. I remember going to my friend Diane's house for a sleepover. I'd never stayed at her house before. We were playing that day, and I remember her telling me that sometimes robbers come into her house at night. I wasn't the sharpest kid on the block, but I remember thinking that was stupid and just ignored her. That night I was asleep, sharing the top bunk with her while her older sister slept below. I woke up suddenly because I was ice cold. Being it was summer, I thought the room was very cold because of air conditioning, and that since she'd kicked the covers off of me, I just needed to grab them and get warm again. However, I remember I was a very little kid who was feeling very safe because there were 2 other people sleeping in the room with me. As I glanced to the foot of the bed, searching for covers, my gaze noticed something in the doorway: 2 dark figures. They were just shadows, no definition or features, but adult-sized and human-shaped. The shadows were darker than the dark hallway. They faced in the direction of her parents' room. One pointed to it, the other nodded, and the first disappeared into the room. The other turned towards me. I was so terrified at that point that I shut my eyes tight. I waited for what seemed like ages, and finally got myself to open my eyes again, just to see if it was gone, and there it was, right in front of my face, hovering above us. Its face was nothing but a blank shadow. I think I must have just kept my eyes shut and at some point fallen asleep. The confirmation of this event, now that I am an adult, comes unwittingly from my parents. I asked them if they remembered my sleepover at Diane's, and they said yes, because I spoke of how I'd seen something in my room that night. My parents still believe I was imagining it, but people who have experienced this themselves know it is too vivid and too obscure to be an imagined event. I know what I saw and get chills even today, even as I write. I wish someone could explain this event to me. What are these shadow figures? Are they malevolent? I suppose since, as a child, I intuitively felt scared. Thank you for reading. This story takes place around the summer through the winter of 2013 to 2014. I don't remember the exact dates, unfortunately, or else I could have further proven that I encountered something at this location. I haven't posted it now before because I only recently found this website and don't really visit it this often. I decided to share this story though because it does fall under the category of personal encounters. As I previously mentioned in another thread, I have a strange companion that's been following me around. It's a black cat that seems to change height and sometimes even color that I can only see out of the corner of my eye. I named him Gabriel at a young age, and I often communicate with him without knowing it, though often I can sense him. I won't go into huge detail here since I already did it elsewhere. As someone said there, he seems to be my spiritual friend. However, this particular story isn't completely about him, though as always, he is involved. One of my friends had just finished high school, having to take summer classes while raising the baby she had while attending school, and had moved in with her biological father. The house seemed run down, in a run-down neighborhood, and it was small, incredibly small. It would be the perfect size for 1 or 2, maybe 3 college students to live there while attending classes at the campus down the street. One of the things I noticed instantly was the fact that tracks ran under the house. They were trolley tracks, from when the town used trolleys to get people places faster when buses weren't really a thing. A great big, abandoned brick and metal building behind it had a sign that just vaguely read, "Trolley Station," on it. The tracks didn't really surprise me. The town I live in has both an Air Force base and also countless train tracks running over roads. Most of them aren't in use anymore, but this place used to be a booming cattle town as well as a military base. It's filed under a small town, but it obviously isn't with all the things that go on. Anyway, the tracks didn't really surprise me, though they did make me feel a little uneasy. I suppose it's perfectly reasonable to believe that things could have happened on the job, accidents on the tracks, or even inside, that could have cost people their lives, but I brushed it off at first. That was until I went inside. The living room wasn't bad, just felt cramped. The kitchen had an uneasy feeling, but I refused to go into the basement. Gabriel kept standing in front of the door any time that I walked by, as if challenging something down there. The basement, as they called it, really just a room slightly lower than the kitchen level, had been turned into a bedroom for her father. One of the rooms, the one facing the street, was my friend and her baby's bedroom. The last bedroom, which was down the tiny hallway, had a window facing the trolley station, full of things that couldn't be stored elsewhere around the house, and I hated that room. I found in that room scratches along all the walls, and one day I decided to use a comparison. I held my hand up close to them and found that they were just wider than my hand, probably a man's hand that had caused these dark furrows on the wall. The wall was covered in a thick layer of paint, which made me wonder how long it would take someone to actually carve such deep scratches into the wall with their fingernails alone. They were definitely in the correct places to be the fingers of a human hand, and there were 3 sets on the walls, one of each except for the one closest to the window, as if this person didn't want to get close to it. Each of the sets had 2 marks, one for both hands, and they were just within my reach if I had lifted both arms. Often in this room, I would see something flash past the window, someone running past the blinds. As I looked though, I realized that whoever or whatever it was had appeared to be running, and there was nothing but a track overgrown with cactus plants. No one in their right mind would run through a patch of those, and even if they had, they would have at least been slowed by the sheer density of the plants. As I looked out the window, I saw the old trolley building, and it looked like a group of about 4 men were gathered around one window, staring out at me. I never looked up all the way to meet their eyes. Gabriel went running out of the room as fast as possible, and I followed. Then there was my friend's room. It was small, cramped like the rest of the house, but she was a completely goth Wiccan. That doesn't mean she worships the devil, by the way. She wanted us to paint the room gray. She also had us add black and red splatters and handprints all over the room. That didn't really creep me out. I thought it would be a nice touch to a haunted house, and my friend just loves this kind of thing. She was already upset since she had decided to have the baby and gotten kicked out by her grandfather, who'd she lived with for years, since she decided to not have an abortion. So we decided to go ahead and paint the room the way she wanted us to paint it. This friend has known about Gabriel for years, and she had always seemed really interested in something. She always wasn't liking the house much because she'd seen how I was reacting to things, and she knew Gabriel was making me want to leave this house. She began mentioning to me that she was surprised I wouldn't go buy the closet to paint, and I realized she was right. I refused to go by the closet, leaving the wall the same ugly yellow color it had been before we had painted it. I didn't know why, but I didn't like that closet. She finished painting the room over there, and after the horrible smell of dying paint was gone, I was basically moved in for the weekend to keep her company since her dad was out working and wouldn't be back for a while. He was a truck driver and was currently driving cross country. During the day, everything seemed pretty calm, but I couldn't sleep during the night. I've never gotten to sleep easily, so it didn't really surprise me, but I heard what sounded like something scratching on the door. It wasn't the dog, which was my first reaction. The giant black lab liked to wander the house and stare at corners and such, and with the room painted so darkly, I couldn't really see her. As I started to get up to open the door for her though, I found the dog practically leaping onto me to push me back down onto the bed. She wasn't growling, but I could see her snarling and on edge, just staring at the door. I'd never seen that sweet little dog so ready to tear something apart. She was a rescue who was terrified of everything. You stepping on a creaking floorboard would send her yelping into a corner. And this behavior had happened before we'd ever brought her into this house. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting to see her like this. My friend and her baby didn't wake up. The noise was too quiet for anyone else to hear. I just remember whispering for the noise to be quiet, and it did. The dog didn't relax for a long while though. I managed to get back to sleep, and when I woke up again, I noticed Gabriel pacing in front of the closet, out of the corner of my eye. The door was open, and I realized how odd that was. For one, heavy boxes of various items had been laid against it on the outside because we hadn't finished packing everything away. And for another, that door was heavy. It opened swinging outwards to the rest of the room and was made of solid wood. It took a lot to close and open it, and it almost always seemed to snag on part of the carpet since the floor was uneven. The dog was practically in my lap at this point. I just felt scared and decided to turn on the radio app on my phone to distract myself. Static was the only thing I got, as well as strange whispered voices. I noticed a shadow stepped out of the closet itself, only to be chased back into it by Gabriel. He seemed to be calling me over, so I closed the door, pushed the boxes back in front of it, and proceeded to just go back to sleep. Nothing else happened while I was there that time, though in the morning, we found the door had marks on it matching the other rooms, and the boxes had been thrown across the room sometime during the night without waking me somehow. My friend wanted to know why I hadn't let the dog in, and why I'd moved the boxes all over the place, knowing I was a light sleeper intended to be full of pranks. I pointed out that I had a badly sprained wrist at the time and couldn't have moved the boxes without waking her, and that the dog had been practically sleeping on top of her during the night. I told her how uneasy Gabriel seemed, and she immediately went to work trying to figure out what was going on. After the weekend ended, I was glad to leave. She was still my friend though, and we visited often. Each time, I noticed that things seemed to move without explanation when I wasn't looking, and the dog refused to pass a certain point in the hallway every day. I also was becoming increasingly unnerved about the fact that the basement was getting physically darker, no matter how many lights were on inside of it. My friend explained that her dad was what she called an energy vampire, and he fed off of negative energy. Beings who also fed off of that energy continued to follow a trail, like breadcrumbs to the room where all of it seemed to be stored. Gabriel kept me as far away from that room as possible. There were more scratch marks around the house, nearly over my head, and the door looked like it had taken a serious beating. I wasn't scared to hang around the closet and even go inside it anymore. All of those negative beings had seemed to migrate to the other room and were content to stay there. I even got up the nerve to visit the other room, where the window faced the trolley station. I didn't see the strange men over in the window anymore. I didn't see anything else that seemed to be even remotely like them or the shape I'd seen dashed by the window. In the direction of the room where all the negative energy was stored, I realized. My friend said there was a portal leading to the realm of the dead in the closet, and she'd closed it. Her dad moved out, apparently not liking his daughter cramping his style. Almost all of the negative energy seemed content to follow him out, though one being apparently remained and liked to slam cabinet doors, torture the poor dog in me, as well as scratch increasingly louder on the doors and walls. Sometimes it even threw things across the room, though the activity almost seemed to grow less violent as I walked in. My friend could only assume it was because it was afraid of Gabriel or something. With this apparent portal closed, my friend moved out of the house with her fiancé, taking the dog and her baby with her. Everything was moved out of the house, and I was glad to never see that place ever again.
This story was told to me by my aunt and uncle who lived near Sung Chung Garden in Ipoh, and of course the eerie things that happened in their neighborhood. It happened a few years ago, and back then the locals were shocked with the news of a man getting shot multiple times in his very own car when he was refilling petrol. Having a tarnished reputation as a member of a triad group and a loan shark, the locals thought it was enemies avenging for his evil deeds. The investigation didn't progress much, and its case is closed at present. But the very car he died in was under his nephew and his name. Therefore, after his death, his nephew had the right to claim the car for his own personal use. Coincidentally, his nephew stays right opposite of my uncle and aunt's house. Both of them and my cousins are dog lovers, so they have a few dogs. The night when the nephew drove home the car, which was at midnight, the dogs were disturbed by a presence, and all of them howled. Not only their dogs, but almost all the dogs in the neighborhood. My aunt was alarmed, and she expressed her concern to her husband, telling him the unusual behavior of the dogs. However, my uncle brushed it off by telling her it might be any female dog having a period, causing high mating desire among the males. She was not sure about his reply and went off to bed. The howling lasted till the wee hours, and they had trouble sleeping. The very next morning, my aunt went over to the opposite, and they talked about how peculiar was the dog's behavior. Soon she found out about the car and how the previous owner died from gunshots. She was terrified by the news and related the matter to my uncle. Basically, nothing they could do. The next few nights, eerie things started to happen in the neighborhood. One, a teenage girl staying not far from the nephew's home, was talking on the phone with her friend when she heard a coarse male voice interrupted their conversation. The voice was very harsh and sounded pitiful, and she was scared and quickly ended the conversation. 2, a lady was preparing dinner in the kitchen when she heard a man whispering and talking at the back lane of her house. She opened the back door, found no one. 3, a lady woke in the middle of the night and heard a man sobbing pitifully outside her house. She decided to peek from her window upstairs and saw a black figure sitting under a tree outside her house and crying. 4, continuous barking and howling of dogs towards the car. Soon the neighbors were complaining about the strange incidents and confronted the nephew's mother. She was concerned about the car too and decided to persuade her son to take the car to a temple for blessing, which her son gladly did. And after the blessing, strange incidents ended and the dogs stopped howling. How strange.
I just got home from this adventure and had to write about it for you guys. I'm a new community member to the Phantom Wagon, and this will be my first, and hopefully not last, story submitted to this channel. I haven't heard every scary story video on YouTube, so I could be wrong, but I've yet to hear any involving storm draining. For those who don't know, draining is a term referred to exploring the tunnels of storm drains or manholes. I didn't even realize it was an actual thing people did. It's treated almost like a sport. Me and my bud are both named David. We both like to go on any random adventures we can come up with. We've gone through over 20 different storm drains in or near our neighborhood, located in Silver Spring, Maryland. By the way, if anyone listening is a local, I have plenty of other stories about well-known Silver Springs legends or creepy people in areas to share, many with documented proof and articles. Leave a comment if you're from my city or close and want to hear some more. It's always fun to see graffiti tags by people from the past, or to even feel like the first people to explore a specific drain with a blank slate, but nothing creepy has happened during our 20 plus explorations. That is, until tonight. If I were being honest, I've been impatiently waiting for something eerie to happen, so I'm clearly drawn to this type of stuff. David discovered a major storm drain. It was almost completely walkable without having to bend over too much as we traveled through the tunnels. He found one where we don't have to Shawshank Redemption shit crawl through like usual. This particular location was an amazing maze of twists and turns of various tunnel options. We took a bunch of photos between David's camera and my shit phone, which would explain the drastic changes in quality. Of course, like many tunnels, immediately we came upon a faded, but still in your face graffiti tag that pretty much says "Welcome to Hell," or in this case, the hellhole. I love graffiti, so seeing a collage of shitty tags from different decades was a cool start to that adventure. I really want to say the noises I heard were only from the people above ground that could be heard faintly, or just the echo of our footsteps in running water creating weird noises. But this would be impossible because it's midnight on a weekday and there was literally no one outside before we got in. Like I said, it could all have a reasonable explanation, but these sounds were too, the best way I can describe it is that they almost sounded like they didn't belong. Not just the noises itself, but it was separate from all of the natural sounds occurring. And I've never heard anything like it. And we've been in plenty of drains like this before with those normal noise combinations of echoes, splashes, and crap. It all started off far away, sounded like a fast wind. This wind sound wasn't steadily creeping up to me, but instead, just suddenly burst a large gust of air directly into my right ear. Keep in mind, it is impossible to be even windy down here. I wasn't even hit anywhere else, only directly right into my ear. It actually hurt. For just a second, my ear felt like it was plugged full of water. That feeling came and went pretty fast. I now have a headache, but didn't even think too much of this. I didn't feel scared, but it was creepy. And once you reach that area of a drain where you're too far from a nearby manhole to pop out of, you do feel trapped. I mean, you really are. If you are in a hurry, there is literally nowhere to escape to. I'll admit it, this kind of adds a rush to the experience. I kept walking when that wind blow happened again, but this time with some accompanying whispers. I didn't make out any actual words, but at the moment, I didn't realize what was happening. The combined air pressure and fainted muttering were now happening sporadically. I started to feel a bit uneasy. In the back of my mind, I thought I was seriously hearing the voices of people. I do believe in ghosts, but I don't always jump to conclusions, so I tried rationalizing the situation. It definitely sounded like whispers smashing in and out of my ear, but I also thought it could have been a weird side effect to a headache, or that I was just having auditory hallucinations. The noises were happening every 10 awkward steps I would take in the puddles. I called down to David to see if he had heard them, but he hadn't. David isn't too much into believing paranormal things like me, so maybe the force was more connected to me because in a way, I wanted to hear it. I don't know how that really works. I've experienced things like this before, but I've only felt emotional responses, such as an unwanted feeling of dread or even a sense of calm, but this time the feelings were more physical than mental. It was penetrating my eardrum and giving me a migraine. Now yes, I did feel uneasy, but only because I didn't know what was going on. This now almost rhythmic pattern of intense voices eating my eardrum lasted for at least 5 minutes, but then the further and further we got into the drains, the noises stopped. What was odd were the graffiti surrounding me during this 5-minute hellish ordeal. Every area of tunnel was coated with terrible anti-Semitic and just plain out racist and ignorant tags. What is extremely fascinating was as soon as we passed through a manhole stop and entered a new connecting tunnel, not only were these walls completely clean from any paint, but the voices and ear pain stopped, and I mean instantly. What was creepy about this area, aside from the racist crap, was its specific location throughout the entire drain system. It wasn't even close to any of the other tag tunnels, but just in a random area of the drains deep within the tunnels, almost like it was on purpose. After walking through these naked walls, we eventually came upon one of the many options of getting out without having to pop a manhole. We walked out of the hellhole back into the stars and neighborhood lights. We looked around and realized, damn, did we travel far or what? It was unbelievable. It didn't feel like we walked that much distance. In fact, we usually feel the opposite with opposite results. Of course, as soon as we came crawling out of a sewer in the middle of fricking night in a shady part of Wheaton, Maryland, some dude was standing at a bus stop and we obviously terrified him. I started to speak out loud to David and pretended like we were looking for our dog. I'm quick to try and make myself look less shady than I already do. I've been told I give off that vibe sometimes, because I always have a pulled-down wool hat, visible tattoos, battle scars, a Newport in hand, and now a dirty face with dripping soaked boots. I swear I don't mean to do it on purpose. I only mention this because the dude started to pick up his phone, and I was thinking, dang, I didn't even tag this time, and I'm still gonna get locked up again. But overhearing the conversation, I think he was doing exactly what I was doing. As soon as it felt like we could stick around, David and I took our time and started to try and trace above ground where we travel below. David has the technology and is also very good at mapping, so he knew where he was going, but before we made those moves, we had no idea where we were and started off in a housing complex, and the more we walked and followed our trail, we eventually figured out exactly where we were. We were now in the area of where the strange noises and ear damage were most active. That is when I started to tell David what I was experiencing there. He believed me. He's a good friend. We continued walking while looking down at David's phone, but then we stopped dead in our tracks, looked at each other, and couldn't believe it. We were walking dead center under a funeral home. I tried to rationalize it as best I could, but knowing the events that preceded this, I came to the conclusion that this couldn't be a coincidence. I think I was experiencing those creepy, painful whispers, because that exact tunnel was literally crossing right through the undergrounds of a funeral home. Whenever I'd been to graveyards, which I do not do anymore, I for the most part always felt a positive vibe, but during this experience, these departed souls did not want me there. I think the offensive graffiti even added fuel to the fire, and this is why I experienced a painful ear and headache. So while nothing extraordinarily scary happened, at least from my version of what scary is, that was definitely a creepy but cool situation. As I write this, it does sound like the perfect idea for a fictional scary story. I mean, come on. Walking in a storm-drained tunnel, literally under a funeral home, and being surrounded by paranormal sounds. It doesn't get more unique than that. I'm sure a more elaborate, embellished, made-up story would be more exciting, but I think this whole discovery in general is exciting enough anyway. David and I also plan on purposely walking under the drains of a funeral home right down the block from our neighborhood. We've been in those tunnels before, but popped out of a manhole before we even reached the boulevard. If my locals are listening, that funeral home in particular is called Collins on University Boulevard. These tunnels are a tighter squeeze, but it'll be worth it, I hope. Thanks for listening. Sure, it could have all been one big coincidence. Maybe it is just an overactive imagination, but I like to stay paranormally optimistic. Is that even a real term? Whatever. Time for a cigarette. It all started in 1967 when my dad had a stroke in the front room. I was then 10 years of age. My parents bought this old cottage in 1963. The house was built in 1740. There had been no problems in the house prior to 1967. When my dad came out of the hospital, he was paralyzed down the left-hand side and was unable to speak. That's when things started to happen in the house. The first thing that happened was my parents were in bed, and suddenly all the blankets waved and rolled completely off the bed. Also, the wallpaper in the bedroom would become soaking wet for no apparent reason. then bone dry next day. As the months passed by, my father regained most of the use on his left side, but never regained his speech. Also, my father after the stroke became nasty and violent towards me. I had to put a bolt on my bedroom door, as he would wander about in the middle of the night and come in my bedroom and just stare at me sometimes, waving a fist. One night, I was in bed, and I woke up to the bed rocking on its own. I put the bedside lamp on and jumped out of bed screaming. I unbolted the door, shouting to my mother. As she entered the bedroom, the bed was still jumping on its own accord. In front of us, we both ran downstairs, and my father knew nothing as he had some sleeping tablets. We walked a while to calm down, then went back to check. It had stopped by then, so I got back in bed and left the lights on. I had no choice. We did have a third bedroom, but to come and go, I had to pass through my parents' bedroom, and as an 11-year-old boy, I was scared of what my dad would do next, so I had to stop in that bedroom. One night, me and my mother were watching television. It was about 11:30 p.m. when we heard a terrible screaming coming from the small cast iron window which led into the back garden near the television. We didn't dare speak to each other, and that stopped after about 4 minutes. The next thing I knew, the television, which was on 4 screwed legs, began to walk towards us, rocking from side to side. It only stopped when the main cord pulled tight. We were by then petrified. The screaming noise had woke my father, and he came downstairs shouting, but due to his stroke, the words were not making any sense. He ran into the back sitting room. My mother said, "Go get your dad, or he might have another stroke," so off I went. Entering the room, it was pitch black. Everything happened so fast, I didn't think about turning the light on. And then I looked at the back window, which led onto the very private, unlit garden. A gray-white figure floated past the window, of the side view. It was very defined. He had a 3-cornered hat, a white beard, walking stick, and a long trench-type coat with 3 buttons on it with no legs visible. I ran out of the room, leaving my father, who was looking out of the other window, who hadn't seen anything. I ran to the other room to my mother. I was unable to speak properly to her for at least an hour. My father just wandered back to bed. In desperation, my mother contacted a medium. She said the spirit was called Jacob, who was only trying to help us through the difficult time. He had been a gardener who got killed when a horse fell on him, the medium said. Things became so bad, doors banging, strange sounds in the middle of the night, not helped by my father, who everybody was scared of. I had an older sister, and she moved out in 1968 to get away from the situation. In the end, my mother put the house up for sale in 1972. And that last night, it was terrible. My father was in bed asleep with those sleeping tablets again, so he was unaware of anything. Me and my mother was huddled up in the front room. We stayed awake all night, doors banging, banging from under the floorboards, moaning noises. Then dawn broke at 6:30 a.m. Everything stopped and went calm. We couldn't wait to move out. After we sold it, nobody lived in it longer than 18 months, till it became empty 25 years ago. Around the time this event occurred, I was around 11 or 12. I am a female, and I guess you could say I live in your basic, small, no creepy town where everybody knows each other and nothing super creepy goes on. Although we do have some surrounding towns that are pretty sketch and full of druggies or whatnot. But anyway, here is my story. Me and my mother were visiting a neighboring town of ours, maybe 10 to 15 minutes away. We were there helping out my stepmom set up a reception for a wedding that would be held later in the week. It took place in a building called the Lions Hall, which is basically a place for get-togethers and such. Now, something you should know now is that the town we were in was one of the sketchier places, and it was in one of the worst sections. Me and my sister were outside of the building, walking around and talking, when this guy pulled up in a truck. Now my stepmom was expecting someone to help carry in a few things, although she didn't really know him. So thinking nothing of it, we just assumed it was him. So then he got out of the truck and went into the building. We could hear him talking to our stepmom. He was there for a while, but then finally came out of the building and went back into his truck. Now at this point, me and my sister were still outside walking around. We noticed he was staring at us, blankly, with no real expression on his face. He sat like that for a while, until me and my sister had enough and walked around to the back of the building. Then that's when he started the truck and slowly crept around the building, sort of following us. We went around and around, doing this for probably 4 minutes or so. We could tell something was seriously off, but then, just as we turned the corner to where he was gone, like poof into thin air. We never heard him drove off or anything, and that was enough for us. So we ran inside and didn't go back out for the rest of the day. We never spoke about our encounter to anyone. So as far as I know, weird sketchy truck guy, let's never meet again. A few months ago, I was staying at my friend's house. Basically, I'd gone to sleep as normal. I usually sleep perfectly, but this time, I woke up at 5:35 and felt weird. I took the blanket from my face and looked to the foot of my bed and saw 2 girls, both blonde, didn't have a face, and had little blue penny dresses on. I looked at them for a good few seconds and turned back over to sleep. I told my clairvoyant friend, and she told me she's always thought I had a talent for seeing the beyond. Thank you for reading. I know this is kind of short, but I guess it was a kind of cool story. I'm living in Birmingham, and I'm thinking there has to be some haunted locations that I could go to and feel around, given the history of the city. I started doing some research, looking for some local haunts, and lo and behold, I come to find out that I live 15 minutes from one of the most haunted places on Earth, Sloss Furnace. The factory was built in the 1800s, and hundreds of men died there due to the grueling nature of the work. I read about the history and ghost stories other people told about the places and decided that this was going to be my first ghost hunt. My trip to Sloss Furnace occurred over the course of 2 days, the first day being my first time, and all I did was just walk around the place, read the exhibit signs, and explore the grounds. They turned the furnace into a museum that is open to the public, and they also use the grounds to host concerts, weddings, and other social events. They happened to be planning for a wedding the first day I was there, and a few tourists were milling around, so I wasn't completely alone, but the place was fascinating. I was able to walk into a few of the off-limits areas and look around. I pulled out my phone, started recording, went into the boiler room, and managed to catch a few orbs in the footage. It was cool, but nothing to write home about. I left, went home, and that was that. On the second day, at Sloss Furnace. My second day at Sloss Furnace will go down in the history books of ghost hunting. I managed to do what the ghost hunters, scariest place on earth, and countless paranormal investigation teams have failed to do, and that is film an actual ghost. One ghost would be impressive indeed, but what if I told you I filmed at least 5 ghosts? I can almost guarantee you that you have never seen ghost footage ever that comes even close to what you are about to see. When I pulled up the second day, it was a rainy, gloomy Sunday afternoon. As I drove to the gate, I saw a sign blocking the entrance saying that the museum was closed. It was hardly secure, so I just parked my car across the street and walked in through the front entrance. There was a construction crew working on the left end of the facility away from the actual furnace itself. When I walked into the entrance, I could see remnants of the wedding party from the day before. Apparently they weren't responsible for cleaning. I made my way into the boiler room, took out my phone, and started recording again. Here I am all alone in a damp, dark factory, listening to the sound of the rain beating down against the roof, armed with only a cell phone. I walked through the boiler room, filming as I went along, and decided to call it a day. It wasn't until I got home, watched the rest of a playoff basketball game, and looked at my phone when I realized what I just captured. I was able to count at least 5 ghosts. The best part about it all is that I have proof. When you look at the film, go to the 320 mark, you will see a ghost. Go to 344, you will see a ghost, and up to 350, and you will see a literal ghost scene. If you slow it down, you will see ghosts peeping from different corners. Amazing. This is hands down the best ghost footage you will ever see. When I was younger, my father told my brother, sister, and myself that there was a ghost story that happened in a family apartment in Chinatown. Apparently, it had something to do with a friend who was visiting the family from out of town. The story took place in the 1950s or later, and whatever the friend experienced scared her enough that she left in the night and never returned. For a long time, my father denied ever having mentioned that there was a ghost story. Only recently, and seeing that my siblings and I were grown, did he finally admit ever telling the story and gave us the full tale. During the 1950s, my grandparents still owned a large Chinese restaurant on Mott Street. Since it opened until very late, they often came home after closing around 4 in the morning. My father and his siblings often helped out working there and would often come home late as well. It just so happened that a friend of my aunt's was staying over that week. Since my aunt was busy working at the restaurant, her friend relaxed in the family apartment, which had a piano in the living room. One evening, the guest was alone in the apartment and decided to play several songs on the piano. She knew that there was nobody in the apartment and played without disturbance. At a certain point, the guest stopped playing, and when she did, she heard the sound of someone clapping their hands in the same room with her. The guest knew that she was supposed to be alone in the apartment. She was so scared by this that she left before anyone from my family returned from work. Through all the time that I'd spent with people and alone in that apartment, I'd never experienced anything strange at all. One possible explanation may be the thin walls that the old buildings in lower Manhattan have. The building was built in 1886, and the fact that someone in the building's stairwell could hear a lot of what's going on inside the apartment. Could the guests have mistaken the sound of someone clapping in the stairwell with someone in the room? Or were the clapping hands so unmistakably near that there was no mistaking that the invisible person was in the same room? I guess we'll never truly know the answer to that question. Chinatown in Manhattan, New York, is the largest Chinatown in the United States, although fast becoming upserved by 2 additional New York City Chinatowns. Chinatown, Manhattan has a long history from the mid-1800s when the first Chinese immigrants arrived off of Ellis Island. As we all know, different cultures see the world uniquely through their own personal beliefs and customs. Many of the earlier Chinese immigrants arrived from Guangdong province in the south of China. At the time, it was a very poor part of the country that had felt the effects of war, famine, and general unrest. The vast majority of these early immigrants even came from just a few hometowns in that same area. Perhaps it is a unique belief from that part of China, but some of these immigrants believe that ghosts don't have chins. When my grandfather arrived in New York City around 1919, he worked in a grocery store that was owned by his brothers and some relatives on 32 Mott Street. Like many of the stores in New York City today, there was, and still exists, a cellar directly below the store, accessible by a metal door on the sidewalk. These cellars were, and are still used today, as stockrooms for inventories. It was in one of these basements where my grandfather had a very strange experience. One day, my grandfather had to go down the cellar to bring up boxes. Climbing down by himself, there was no one else in the cellar. Although it was during the day, it was still very dark in the recesses of the cellar, which stretched back under the store into the shadows. Midway between moving boxes, my grandfather noticed, out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing in the shadows. My grandfather recalled that the figure gave off a very malevolent presence. Knowing that there should have been no one in the cellar, my grandfather continued facing away from the figure, but kept looking at it from the corner of his eye. My grandfather said, "Who's there?" From the direction of darkness, the figure gave a low and undistinguishable reply, more a mumble than a word. My grandfather knew that the figure would disappear if he looked straight at it, so he tried to get more details of its appearance. The low voice showed that the presence was a man. Its shape was definitely that of a man. My grandfather also noticed the presence had no chin. Surely it was a ghost. Giving into the urge, my grandfather finally turned his head to look, but there was nothing in the spot where the figure had just been. Knowing of this story as he was growing up, my father also had to frequently enter that same cellar to get things. Sometimes he would look through the corner of his eye into the shadows, but was always disappointed not to see anything. For those of you who live in the New York City area, you might be interested to know that the grocery store is still around. Instead of selling groceries, it's now a gift shop. The original woodwork has not been changed, and the store looks like the same as it did when my grandfather worked there in the early part of the 20th century. It's located on 32 Mott Street. I do know the people who currently run the shop, but I've never mentioned this story to them. Chinese believe in a phenomenon that can be translated into to be weighed down by a ghost. This is a fairly common occurrence in which someone wakes from sleeping to find themselves completely paralyzed but conscious. During these short moments, people often report unexplainable experiences, including hearing voices talking to them, feeling sensations, and hearing people in the room that should not be there. A relative of mine lived in Confucius Plaza in Chinatown, New York City. Those familiar with this part of town will recognize it as the tallest building in Chinatown. This curved brick, 44-story co-op rises at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge entrance and forms a unique wind tunnel. There are many urban legends about Confucius Plaza, which slowly emerged since it was built in the mid-70s. My relative lived alone in his Confucius Plaza apartment, which had a kitchen, bedroom, and living room. On one particular evening, my relative fell asleep on his couch in the living room. He later woke to find himself totally paralyzed and unable to even open his eyes. As he lay there, he heard someone enter through his front door, walk through every room of his apartment, and leave through the front door, slamming it as they left. At the moment the door slammed, my relative was suddenly able to move again and immediately sprang up. He opened the front door, but saw no one going down the long hallway. He searched through the entire apartment and found nothing missing or disturbed. In the summer of 2011, I accompanied my uncle back to the US. He now lives in Iowa. I spent a week with his family before returning back to the Philippines. On my return trip, I decided to take a few more days off and see the sights of Chicago. I've been to the US on numerous occasions, but this was my very first to Chicago. I was looking so forward to baseball and food. I booked a room at the Congress Plaza Hotel because of its accessibility and reasonable rate. It was close to subways, where I could go with ease to a Sox game at Comiskey Park and to O'Hare for my flight home. The hotel is quite old, and it looks old. You can hear it creak in some areas. The room I was assigned to was on the 4th floor, I think. It was on a corner, and you could see Roosevelt University on East Congress Parkway when you look out the window. The hallway outside leading up to my room was always eerily quiet. The first night after I got back from eating out, the room became really cold. I thought it was really strange because it was nice and warm outside. Also, it got cold suddenly, but not gradually. I ended up sleeping with the bed sheet, blanket, and bed cover on top. It was cold just that one night. I would be out during the day to explore the city and get back after dinner. Every time I got to my room, some of my stuff would be moved. I initially thought it was the cleaners, so I hung a do not disturb sign outside my door. I would still get back to my room with my stuff moved. Nothing was missing though. All my stuff was accounted for. What validated the rumors I've heard that this place is haunted was when I saw a shadow figure. There was a dresser at the foot of my bed with a biggish mirror. While in bed one night, recalling my visit to Chicago's Field Museum that day, I saw reflected on the mirror a shadow. It was peeking out from the bathroom door that was slightly ajar. The lights were off inside the bathroom, but I could still make out a distinct human shape. It was darker than the dark bathroom, but it was solid. I stared at the reflection for I don't know how long. I couldn't really tell if it was staring back at me, as it had no face, but somehow I had the feeling that it was spying on me. There was just solid blackness where a face should have been. I blinked to make sure I wasn't just seeing things, and sure enough, it was still there. I got out of bed to confront it. Honestly, I'm not sure what I was thinking then, but it vanished. I went back to bed, looked at the mirror again. It was no longer there. Has anyone been to the same hotel and experienced these? Thanks for reading. Now, this is not an event that had taken place in front of my own eyes, but has surely happened to my grandfather. My dad told me this story, and it gave me a chance to look at spirits who have yet to rest, but are not actually scaring people to death. Here is my grandfather's tale. My grandfather was only 36 years of age, and he of course needed a job. He had looked in agriculture, the stores down the street, even the Starkiest factory that was quite a ways away. No jobs whatsoever. Finally, after 3 weeks of looking, he had seen an ad for a wanted bus driver for the night shift position. At the time, he didn't care what kind of job it was or when he had to work. All he cared about was supporting his family. After a few days, he had gotten the job to work from sundown to an hour before sunset. The bus driving job was steady. He really didn't have any riders unless it was someone who also worked late. Soon, he had picked up on which riders came on, what time they came on, and where they should be dropped off. But a year into the job, he had gotten a new rider who would only ride for that one night. He saw the man standing at a stop to which no one had stood before, and for the first time, he could stop there. The man was described as well-rounded, pale, with a blue suit, which was very odd because it is so hot in Samoa, even at night. Like every other customer, my grandfather had welcomed him with a smile. Being the kindly fellow, my grandfather also tried to talk to him. He asked him, "How are you doing this evening? Where did you come from?" and just normal conversation questions. The only thing this man replied to is where he should be dropped off. My grandfather tried to get something cheerful out of the pale man, but there was no response. As soon as the bus got to the destination as stated by the man, my grandfather opened the door, looked up to the mirror, and said to him, "Here is your stop, sir," and looked behind. Usually, at this time, you can hear the passenger get their stuff together and proceed to the front, but not this time. He heard dead silence. He looked up at the mirror again and saw nothing. This is a true story, and although I don't believe in ghosts, it did raise some goosebumps. The first week, I was driving around 1 to 2 a.m. I got a signal to pick up a rider at the music factory. At that time of night, the streets were dead and the music factory was empty. The address didn't seem right to me and kept having me circle around back to a deserted old road. Thinking that the GPS must be off a few blocks, I decided to circle around the next few streets. I even made 5 phone calls to no avail, no answer or voicemail. I started thinking maybe I was being set up to be robbed. But I guess my curiosity got the best of me and I had to see for myself. After all, somebody could be drunk or hurt. Let me backtrack a bit and explain that the Uber screen shows both my car and the figure of a person and a closing distance as you approach. The road behind the building is old and unkempt. I thought to myself, this doesn't look good. I kept driving further back and the distance between me and my rider closed in, until finally the road came to a dead end. My display spoke and told me to turn right and my rider would be 100 feet away on my right. I turned slowly to my right and saw a very old cemetery. The gates were standing wide open. Off in the distance, about 100 feet away, was a white foggy figure standing by a headstone. My hair stood on end, and I was instantly covered in goosebumps. Needless to say, I decided to skip that fare. In October of 2009, I started a new job working security. I got posted in Banning, California, at an Edison substation. I was working graveyard, patrolling around the outside of the substation. I'd been there for a few nights. Nothing really seemed out of place at first. We had 4 checkpoints we had to tag with a GPS device. We didn't have access to the inside, nor the east side of the area, due to a neighboring business. The south side fenced the street. The west had a narrow path to walk and a business beyond that, surrounded by a chain-link fence. The north side had a field, and after about 50 feet, a set of train tracks. Checkpoint 1 was the southeast side. Checkpoint 2 was the southwest corner, which I posted my truck. The northwest was checkpoint 3, and 4th was the northeast. There was an area by the train tracks not on the patrol, but it was the actual northeast corner. I walked up to the far area beyond my normal patrol area, as I was prone to do. As I came back around, I felt the air suddenly get colder and heavier. I thought nothing of it and continued on by checkpoints 4 and 3. As I started down the corridor between 3 and 2, I saw a figure about 6 foot, blonde hair, thin build, and slightly glowing walk through the fence, from the inside the substation, and through the fence on the opposite side, traveling from east to west. I carried a handheld spotlight since there was so little lighting to the area, and the guy was nowhere to be seen. I ran back towards checkpoint 4 and regained my composure. I cautiously walked back to the area I had seen the figure to make sure the fence hadn't been cut. No holes, cuts, or anything else I could find. No footprints, nothing that suggested it had happened. I went back to my truck and dropped the tailgate and sparked up a cigarette. I set it down to grab something out of my lunchbox, and as I went to retrieve my smoke, it glowed like someone was dragging off of it and then fell to the ground. I thought at first maybe it was a breeze, but the night was completely still. I'm not sure if it was a ghost or maybe residual energy. I'm not sure if the substation still has security there. I was transferred off that post for a better position a week or so later. If there's no security and you decide to visit, I don't remember directions. Watch for Banning PD because they do frequent the area. I guess it started when I was little. My mom and I have always been a little more open to the things unexplainable. I was about 5 years old, making my brothers 4 and 3. My brother, who was 3, is autistic, and his tick was trains. My mother would hear his toy train go off. It made choo-choo noises and played music and flashed lights when you pushed buttons on the side. Every night for months, and she thought it was just us playing at night. She would come back to check in on us, and we would be sleeping. At the time, me and my siblings shared a room. Finally, my mom took the batteries out of the toy train. The next night, without it having batteries, my mom once again heard the train going off. Me and my brothers were downstairs, and my mom went upstairs to check on the noise she heard. She turned the train off and returned downstairs. A few minutes later, I swear I heard giggling, and I know I was young, but I clearly remember the figures of a little girl and boy walking down the stairs. It was just shadows on the walls, like their outlines. When I looked from the wall to the stairs, nothing was there. When I got older, my mom told me that night, after we saw the shadows of the kids, that she told the kid ghosts, if you're good, you can stay. If you're bad, you have to leave. My mom said she never had experiences with them again. The toy train never went off on its own again. I don't know what happened. I can't explain it. To this day, my mom still swears she saw the 2 kids. I don't know if they were bad. My mom said we were never harmed. The train thing going off went on for months until the night it went off without having any batteries. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I have no idea. I was a long-haul trucker for many years. In December of 2004, I had a delivery in Winchester, Virginia, and a second stop in Washington, D.C. At my first stop, I was delayed and didn't get unloaded until 2 a.m. I left Winchester heading east on Highway 7. Around 2:30, I came to the intersection of Highway and a Route 601 near Bluemont. At a gas station, I pulled in to check my map of Washington in anticipation of my delivery. The station was closed at that hour. There was virtually no traffic going by, and it was a cold, moonless night. While I was sitting there, someone knocked on my door, startling me. I jumped and turned off my interior light so I could see outside and rolled down my window. A man was standing there in an airline flight crew uniform. He had 4 stripes on his shoulders, indicating a captain. He was without a jacket on a very cold morning. He climbed up on the step of my cab. He smelled like he had bathed in kerosene. When he got close to my face, I could see that his cap had the TWA insignia on it. "Could you give me a lift?" he asked in a voice that seemed raspy. I assumed it was from the cold. I was really taken off guard. It was odd. I was in a dark, rural area on a freezing night being asked by an airline pilot wearing short sleeves for a ride. I asked him where he was headed. "I work for TWA. I gotta get the Dullies to work a flight. Please give me a ride. I'll pay you," he responded. "Well, how about I give you a ride to the next open store where you can call a cab?" I offered. "Okay, thank you, he mumbled. He said that we could descend. I didn't know what he was talking about, but I didn't want the guy to freeze out there. He climbed down and shuffled around the front of the truck. When he passed the first light, I was struck by the fact that he seemed to have long sideburns, a la Elvis. When he continued on to the right, he totally vanished. I don't mean faded away. He just ceased to exist. I jumped out of the truck and looked all around with a flashlight, even under the truck. He was just disappeared. As I continued on towards Washington, I remembered something odd. TWA had gone out of business over 2 years ago. What was going on, I wondered, totally perplexed and shaken by the experience. When I got home, I did some online research. What I found has totally turned my beliefs upside down. I've always thought that ghost stories were hokum, but with what I learned, I'm no longer sure. It turns out that on December 1st, 1974, a TWA Boeing 727 Flight 514 descended prematurely through a low cloud deck and slammed into a rocky outcropping on Mount Weather, Virginia. The aircraft disintegrated with all 92 people on board killed. The flight had originated in Columbus, Ohio, and was supposed to land at Washington National Airport. It was diverted to Washington's other airport, Dulles International, because high winds had closed National. According to cockpit voice and flight data recordings, the crew mistakenly believed that air traffic controllers had cleared them to descend to 1,800 feet from their previous altitude fix of 7,000 feet. This error, combined with strong downdrafts, caused the aircraft to hit the mountain at 1,600 feet above sea level. At the last second, they broke out of the overcast, only to see the rocky and snow-covered mountain looming in their windscreen. The captain's last words to his co-pilot were, "Get some power on," just moments before the recording abruptly ceased. The place of the impact was less than a mile south of where I encountered whoever or whatever it was that I saw almost exactly 30 years later. I don't want to definitely say it was a ghost, but the fact remains that there was someone who appeared to be an airline pilot with a very dated hairstyle, wearing a uniform of a defunct business. I no longer am a trucker, but this has troubled me for over 2 years. If anyone would have any insight into this, I'd appreciate your help. Thank you. Maybe most of us have experienced driving at night, maybe in a foggy night, a cold night, or even some people have been on a bus on their way home. In my case, I was on my motorcycle. It all happened in Mexico. This was exactly 2 years ago. That night, I had gone to my friend's house. We watched a movie. It started around 9 p.m. and finished at 11 p.m. It was around 12 a.m. when I left his house. There I was, at max speed on the road, just feeling the breeze on my bike. To get to my house, there is only one trail. There is another road to get to my house too, but it takes forever, so I took the one I always go on. It was a silent night. I could only hear the owls in the air as I was passing through this trail. At a long distance, I saw a kid. He was just standing there in the middle of nowhere. I got surprised, and at the same time, I felt really scared. As I got closer to him, I slowed down a bit. He asked for a ride, but of course I denied to give him one because it was midnight, and this was not normal. I continued the trail like nothing ever happened. Whenever I'm on my bike, I sometimes close my eyes for a bit just to feel the breeze. Somehow, it feels like I'm flying, so I close them for a couple of seconds. Once I opened them, I was not on the same trail anymore. I was on the other road I did not take. I noticed because I know my trail like the tip of my palm. I also knew I was on the other trail because sometimes I would take that trail to visit my uncle. I decided to go back and take the same trail because it was going to take forever. Once I got on the same path again, I noticed the same kid up ahead. This time I felt pretty scared and nervous. I slowed down and decided to give him a ride. He got on my motorcycle. I did not even talk to him. I just kept on going. After a few minutes, there was a curve up ahead. After passing this curve, I turned around and the boy was not on my motorcycle. I felt really scared at this moment, and I just had this weird feeling. And so I got home. I told my parents about it next day, and they surprisingly said that there was another person who experienced the same incident that I had. My parents told me not to drive so late, and as a result, I tended to listen to them. As some of you know from reading my previous stories, I've just recently moved to Los Angeles with my fiance and little brother, and you would also know about the new houses I've lived in, I'm currently living in, and the things that have taken place in those houses. Well, I guess that isn't enough for me, because I have to deal with them at work now. I'm a mechanic at a very popular and very busy motorcycle shop. Every day, myself and 6 other guys pull through maybe 25 plus bikes in a 10-11 hour day. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but we don't just do repairs. We also do custom paint jobs and other custom jobs, so it's quite time consuming. So in other words, it's ridiculously busy and we don't have time to mess around. However, someone seems to have the time to pull pranks on us. This past Monday was busy as hell. The showroom was having a huge sale, and for some reason, the owner thought we should have a sale on a few things in the shop, which was retarded because, as I said, it was busy as hell. It was around noon, and I decided to take an hour and go to Jack in the Box. When I got back to my work area, all of the drawers on my toolbox were open, and every single one of my sockets were scattered across the floor. I yelled over at Rod and told him if he needs to borrow something, not to make such a mess. I used a little more colorful words, though, because I wasn't too impressed. He told me he wasn't even near my bench. He was doing airbrush the whole morning. Well, the pranks went on for the rest of the day. Nothing as bad as before, just missing tools, and I would turn around to find that drawers were open when I knew they were closed. Finally, it was time to close up for the night. Since I am the manager of the maintenance department, I have to stay an hour after everyone has left to do invoices and whatnot. I was at my bench pricing out a few things a customer wanted when I heard some coughing. It was coming from the long hallway at the rear of the shop that leads to the dumpsters. A special code is needed to open that door and can only be opened from the inside. Plus, it makes a very annoying creak, followed by a loud slam when it is opened. So I was a little shaken to find no one there when I went to check it out. I walked down the corridor to go see if the door was propped open at all. No, closed tight. I just turned around to head back to my bench when I heard the coughing sound again, only this time it was coming from the shop. I jogged down the hall and into the shop to see who was there. No one. This is when I just stood there and went, great, now I have to deal with them at work too. I went over to my bench where I had left my invoices, which were very important and needed to be put into my computer right away, and they were missing. I gave up. I had enough. So I grabbed my coat and left. Didn't finish sweeping, didn't power wash the floors, nothing. I got home and told my fiance and brother about what happened. Chris thought this was hilarious because he usually gets all of the annoying ghosts pulling pranks on him, so he got his little cheap shots in, and that was it. The next day, I got to work, and when I turned on the shop lights, I could not believe my eyes. Everyone's tools were spilled all over the floor, and a hose that I had rolled up nice and neat before I left was pulled out. Finally, I had enough, so I started yelling at the spirit. After yelling at it, I began cleaning up the tools and putting them back where they belonged. As I was cleaning, I swear I heard a very mischievous chuckle coming from the corridor. "Yeah," I said, "hilarious. I'm having the time of my life over here. So funny." Basically sounding like a retard. If someone came down and saw me arguing with nobody, I'm sure that would have looked a little weird. The rest of the day wasn't that bad, until closing time came and I was alone again. I started to smell the faint smell of a cigarette. I followed the smell to, you guessed it, the corridor leading to the dumpsters, and, yep, you guessed it again, nothing. I turned back to my area to finish sweeping, and I noticed at the corner of my eye, the missing invoices from the previous day were neatly stacked on my workbench. I leaned on my broom and smiled. I guess I finally got through to the spirit, and he felt bad or something. Since that week, nothing out of the ordinary has happened, other than a power outage that happened when two other mechanics got into a yelling match. Was the spirit angry that they were arguing? I don't know. I'm just going to say it was a coincidence. Until next time, God bless. It was the middle of August, and the harsh wind blew hot and humid, kicking up a storm for the evening hours. Off to the north, the black clouds had started to brew and roll. It was about 6:30 p.m., and my date was late. He would not tell me where he planned to take me. It was a surprise. Now, being 30 minutes late, I begun to wonder what could possibly be going on, if I would be going anywhere. I walked out into the open front porch, and could almost smell the rain coming. It began to grow darker. I decided if he arrived, we would just stay at my house until the storm passed. I then started to worry that he may be riding his motorcycle. Motorcycles and thunderstorms do not mix. He knew I despise motorcycles, but, well, hopefully, he would be in his truck. As the dreaded motorcycle came around the corner, the rain began to spit big fat drops. He got off the bike and indicated we needed to hurry up. I told him I was not going. It was raining. I was not getting on the bike, and I wouldn't even if it was not raining. After he became increasingly angry with me and refused to stay at my house until the storm passed, he got on the motorcycle and started off into the downpour. I looked up, and all I could see was flashing red and blue lights, such as those coming off an emergency vehicle. I watched for a few minutes, thinking there must have been an accident right in front of my house. I could hear screams of agony, sounding if they were coming from in a few feet in front of me. No one was there. I turned around to grab my iced tea I had brought on the porch with me. As I turned back, the lights were all gone. There was no evidence of an accident either. I shook my head and turned to go into the house. As I turned, I could hear the unmistakable roar of his motorcycle starting, and then screeching tires. I whirled around, and nothing was there. I turned back around after a few moments, and decided I would sit on the porch for a while.
Surely the heat had gotten to me, causing me to see and hear things. After 20 minutes later, my mom called me at the screen door telling me I had a call. I asked who it was, as my mom was familiar with all of my friends. She stated she didn't recognize the voice. I went in and answered the phone. The voice on the other end of the line clarified my name and asked how I was related to Mark, my would-be date from earlier. I told him I was not related, that we had been dating for a few weeks. I was then informed that he had my name and phone number. Mark had been in an accident on his motorcycle. The roads were wet and slick. He skidded out of control and came to a rest on a couple of those sand barrels that are used for street barriers. As the accident was being described to me by phone, I looked up and saw the flashing red and blue lights again. I heard the screech of tires. I closed my eyes tightly and said a silent prayer. As I opened my eyes, again the lights and the screeching sounds were gone. I was told to contact his parents and come to the hospital. They would not release his condition to me over the phone. I told my mom. She drove me to his parents' home, and I told them of the call. We all went to the hospital together. By the time we arrived at the hospital, Mark's left leg had been put into a cast all the way to his hip. His scrapes and cuts had been cleaned on his arms and face, and he was arguing that he did not need to have the cervical collar on. Mark ended up staying in the hospital overnight for observation, but he eventually recovered completely. We did not continue to date after that night because he stated I jinxed him. About 3 years later, he had another accident on a motorcycle, which ended up breaking his back and his pelvis, causing him to give up motorcycles for good. In 2009, I was living in Texas at the time. I was working out at the prison on day shift. It happened to be on lockdown at the time, meaning no one out of cell movement for the offenders. I was working with my partner, having a conversation with them to keep us awake, because if you didn't, you would fall asleep. It was that boring. I was talking to him when I stopped in midsection. What I saw did not frighten me, but surprised me, as I usually did not see any or much activity in the ghost area in the prison. I worked there almost 2 years, and this was the first sighting out of 2 that I had at this prison. I saw a white man walk up to the last cell, dressed in offender's clothes, look over me, and then walk through the prison door. I got up to check on it, thinking no way. All I saw was an offender sleeping on his bed. He was Hispanic. I walked back to the table where my partner was sitting. He asked me what was wrong. At first, I refused to tell him because the last thing I wanted was for him or offenders overhearing it and being ridiculed. Finally, he came out and said he believes in ghosts, that he's seen them before, and then started telling me stories of the other prison he worked at. Keep in mind, most ghosts are seen most active at night, or when there is not much activities going on. I finally had the courage to tell him, "Thanks for reading my story." Located in Munnsville, West Virginia, is the old West Virginia State Maximum Security Prison. Now, this prison has a long and sometimes violent history. Prisoners were murdered in their cells by other inmates during riots, and most notably, they were put to death in the electric chair, Old Sparky, who was built by an inmate from that facility. The prison is closed now, but you can still tour it, and if you are brave enough, even spend the night there. Once we had received our initial briefing about the facility, we were allowed to tour it on our own and pretty much go wherever we wanted, even places the public isn't allowed. While touring the facility, I was in a section of the prison known as the Sugar Shack, supposedly where some of the worst offenders were housed. I was the only person in this section of the prison at the time, and while I was up on the 3rd tier, inspecting some of the old cells, when down below me, the cell door slammed shut. Now, this wouldn't have come as much of a surprise to me if it weren't for the fact that all the doors had closed at once, which is what they are supposed to do, but they are controlled by a lever from a central location, which I could see from my vantage point, and no one was there, and the lever was still in the up position. Taking that as a cue, I left that section of the prison and made my way down to the basement in the location of the hole. This was a place they say drove some inmates mad. While in the basement, I kept having the feeling of someone following me, and as I grew near to the hole, a feeling of dread and despair almost overwhelmed me. I kept my senses, though, and started to make my way deeper into the basement. I caught the glimpse of a figure, just off in the shadows, moving from right to left, that should have brought them into the light. What little there was, but they never appeared, and I didn't see them go the other way. Once again, I took this as a cue to leave. I went from there up to the medical and dental ward of the facility. No physical events took place there, just a sense of foreboding over the area. This all led me to believe that something is still behind the walls of the prison, and that they may never be able to leave. I'm going to do an all-night ghost hunt of the facility, and I plan on taking some video and audio equipment and see if I can capture anything on film or tape. Thanks for reading my experience. My following story is about my visit to the famous Fremantle prison, Western Australia in 2009, when I was around the age of 14. I attended the Torchlight tour with my best friend and her mother. The Torchlight tour runs for 1 hour and 30 minutes and is completely in the dark. All you have is a small torch that the tour guides hand out to you. The prison itself was actually pretty old. It was created in the 1850s. Back then, I wasn't very informed of the paranormal, and quite frankly, I was a bit of a skeptic. I had heard that the Fremantle prison was quite haunted and very notorious for sightings of apparitions. I eagerly wanted to experience some kind of ghost for myself, to put my skepticism to rest. We toured Fremantle prison because it was my friend's mom's idea. She thought it'd be a little fun outing for us, as she liked to keep us entertained and interested. This tour, from what I remember, was around the winter months, so it took place at 6:30 p.m., and being winter, was very dark by then. I had a digital camera, the basic kind, that I had brought along in the hopes to try and capture something out of the ordinary. I'll just note that since this was 5 years ago, I can't remember every single area we were shown, but I have vivid memories of the places I do remember seeing and being in. So if you've ever had a tour and mine seems off as to which areas were entered first, I apologize for my poor memory. I've tried remembering what each area was called, but I'm still unsure and can't be bothered doing tons of reading to research it. We were waiting for the tour group and to be called, as we got there quite early, so my friend and I were sitting on a low rock wall, mucking around just near the entrance to the prison grounds. I remember taking a few silly snaps together and taking random shots of the entrance here and there, reviewing them with my friend to see if we had discovered anything in the photos. Nothing came up, yet. The tour guide yells out for the group to gather and get prepared. He pulls out a large box full of little black torches and says, "These are yours to keep as a souvenir to remember your time here." As each person in the group took a torch, we entered the block. I think it was one of those rooms where they search the convicts, strip them, and give them prison attire to wear. There was a long locker room type bench, big enough for the whole group to sit on. The tour guide told us to find a seat, then proceeded to tell us a little history, what we can expect from the tour, and basic rules. The first room in the building we entered was what I believe to be a kitchen. It had these huge metal type containers, and I don't remember if we were told what they were used for. I took a couple of snaps and followed the group to the next area. I believe the next place we were shown was the courtyard leading to all the other areas of the prison. The tour guide stopped and gave us some more history as I snapped pictures of each section of the courtyard, including a picture of the guide. He then led us to the main cell block, which felt super eerie and cold. Above us was what the prison named the suicide net. As there were numerous cells on different levels, it was popular for inmates to throw themselves off the side and fall to their death. It took 2 years for the government to install the suicide net, so as you could imagine, prisoners were still launching themselves over the railing. As the guide was telling us about the stories, a dummy appeared out of nowhere with a net catching its fall. Most of the group were quite jumpy, as you could imagine. Exploring deeper into the block, The tour guide told us about artwork that the convicts had done on their cell walls. We weren't allowed to take photos of the art with flash on because it can fade the paint. I took pictures of the other cells in the hopes of capturing something paranormal. After we toured the cells, we moved out to another courtyard for where the inmates would go daily to stretch their legs. The next thing we came across was the whipping post in another section outdoor area. The tour guide explained it would be used to punish convicts by whipping them and lashing them, and then covering the convicts with salt. The guide asked for a volunteer, and being the weird child that I was, raised my hand immediately. Giggling like an idiot, I gave my friend the camera and asked her to take photos of me while the tour guide demonstrated the punishment procedure. I remember that I couldn't stop laughing as he was showing the demonstration. In the courtyard, there was a freedom mural that was painted by an inmate. It was beautiful, a sunset behind a beautiful field of lush green grass and tall trees. The tour guide then proceeded to show us death row, to which I snapped a picture before we entered, when an actor wearing prison attire popped out of one of the cells and scared the living poop out of all of us. He then explained the history on death row while each of us briefly popped our heads in the cells before a guide then took us to the gallows. The gallows felt extra eerie. Seeing the rope and the open trap door was super creepy. I took a couple of snaps before the guide stopped us to tell us about the convicts who were hanged. After that, we went to the church. This area felt almost frantic, as if it were full of people, noting that torchlight tour groups are less than 35 people, even though the church was very spacious. I took a few photos of the cross, then sat down on the bench to rest with my friend and her mom. As we took in the atmosphere, I turned around to take more pictures. We got back to my friend's house rather late. The prison is quite far from where we live, and we're extremely tired. Before we decided to hit the sheets, I thought it'd be a good idea to review all of the pictures I had taken. A few silly pictures of my friend and I, a few of the entrance to the prison, and some rather odd photos. The first odd photo was in the kitchen of the big metal tubs. In between the two tubs were these perfectly round, different color orbs, about 4 or 5, some of them transparent and some of them full. They were all different sizes. The next photo was of our tour guide in the courtyard. Above him looked like what I assumed to be the moon, but with zooming in and inspecting further, it was transparent. It almost was like a creamy color. The photo after that was of a random spot in the courtyard, the creepiest of the entire series. There in that photo stood a man in what looked like a white doctor's coat. You could barely see his facial features, but I could make out that he had glasses. He was completely transparent, and only his head, shoulders, and torso could be seen. He had no legs in the picture, but you can see his long coat hanging freely. Next to him was a large transparent orb that almost had like a green aura around it. The rest of the photos had a substantial amount of orbs. It was crazy. Numerous sizes, colors, and transparency. The most orbs were in the church, floating around the cross. Maybe that's why it felt rather crowded in there. Unfortunately, I deleted these phones off my camera after having them for a few years. I didn't feel the need to have them anymore, but I highly regret it now after thinking about my experience the other day. It would have been great to share the photos with you all, especially the one of the doctor. I apologize if this was a rather long submission, but thank you so much for reading. When I was 9 or 10, my family and I took a ferry to Port Townsend. We walked along the beach and eventually began to explore the town. One of the first places we came to was a courthouse and jail turned museum, a single lady running it. I remember it being empty except for us and the lady. The first floor is the courtroom. Go down a staircase, and that leads to the jail cells downstairs. We looked around for a short while, and then decided to go downstairs. As you were going down the stairs, the cells slowly come into your view. Poised inside the cells were lifelike dummies positioned in various poses. If you don't expect to see them, then you're going to be startled. Once we reached the cells, my mom saw two evil-looking spirits inside the cells. One of them was an old lady shackled to the wall, with long shaggly hair, staring at her with an evil expression, a terrible, able grin with no teeth. The second was a man. She said he was very nasty looking. My mom later told me she wanted to bolt up the stairs right up then. My experience there was a lot tamer. My dad walked into the cells to see what it was like. When he wanted me to come in, as I tried to walk towards the cells, it was like there was an invisible shield around the cells, and it was preventing me being close to them. At least that's what it felt like. Needless to say, we went to that museum again. The lady in charge never mentioned any ghosts. Either she never went downstairs, or if she did know, kept it a secret. We didn't come across any ghosts in Port Townsend that I can recall. Thank you for reading. When I was 12, which was last year, I went to work with my mom. She worked at Boulder County Jail until I moved. Now, my mom was a nurse at this jail and worked nights, so I went to work with her. Being the adventurous type that I am, I went wandering off. I explored everywhere. I went through every building I could find. It was cool. That night, at exactly midnight, I was looking through the little window on a door that leads to the kitchen in the jail. So as I was looking in there, the big metal spoon to one of the pots started turning. Now, with that being creepy enough, the figure of a man started to appear, or at least the outline of him did. From what I could see, he looked like he was maybe in his late 30s or early 40s and was a little bit plump. As I watched the figure turn the spoon to the pot, he looked at me straight in the eye, and then he kind of faded away. I stood peering through that window for a second or two to see if he was going to come back. He never did. A few hours later, at about 2 a.m., I went back to the kitchen to see if he was there again. And he was. But this time, there was another figure in the kitchen with him. This one looked like he was about my age. I stood there amazed for a few minutes. Then both of the figures looked at me, smiled, did what looked like a wave goodbye, and faded. I never saw them again. A few nights after going to work with my mom, I asked her if any of the cooks that worked at the jail had died. She told me this really long story about how he brought his son to work one day, and they both mysteriously died at the jail. She told me the night that I went to the jail with her was the 5-year anniversary for the death of the cook and his son. I never forgot that night, and I don't think I ever will. I am a 56-year-old Vietnam veteran and business consultant. I do not do drugs and do not understand the following story. We used to live in a 2-story, 10-year-old house in Fremantle, California. We lived there until May of 2003. In December 2002, just a few days before Christmas, I woke up at about 5:30 or 6 a.m. and walked over to the bedroom window. I parted the vertical blinds and cursed under my breath because it was still raining like it had been for days. As I turned away from the window, my body chilled from head to toe. Standing right in the middle of our bedroom doorway was this huge ghost, dressed in a hooded brown robe. The guy was at least 7 feet tall and filled the whole doorway. Where his face should have been in the big hood was just like a swirling mass of energy, and you also couldn't see any hands or feet. But he totally filled the whole doorway. As I looked at him, he extended his arms forward like he was offering me the short staff or rod that he was holding. It was maybe 24 inches long. Then I turned my head away for a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. I left my wife asleep as I drove to work, still kind of in shock and debating whether to tell my wife. I decided to and called her on my cell phone. She was silent for a few months, then said, "Oh my God, that explains it. I thought I was dreaming, but I opened my eyes after you left, and this huge figure in a long brown robe and hood was leaning towards me from your side of the bed, like he was offering me this short rod or stick. Then when I sat up in bed, he was gone." Now we were both feeling kind of strange.
That night, on the way home from work, my wife stopped to use a gas station restroom, something she'd never done before since she only worked 20 minutes from home. When she arrived home, she pulled into the garage and pushed the button to close the garage door behind her. As soon as she stepped into the house, she could see it had been robbed. Our son Colin, who lived with us, had come home 5 minutes earlier and had surprised two armed gunmen up on the second floor in the dark. Colin ran out of the house with the robbers behind him. They got away, but hadn't stolen anything. If my wife had arrived home just a few minutes earlier, as she usually did, she would have locked herself in the house with two armed robbers. I do not understand what has happened. Who was the brown-robed figure? Was he there that morning to warn us about what was going to happen that night? I don't know, but it's kind of creepy. He never appeared again, but that night Colin reminded us that several weeks earlier he had been alone with his girlfriend in the living room sitting on the sofa. Something caused him to get the chills. As he looked up, he saw this robed figure looking down at them from the railing in the loft above them. They quickly left the house. When Colin originally told me his story, I had told him that he had a very active imagination. Then a couple weeks later, the robed figure appeared to me and then my wife. That night, as I was cutting sections of round, rod-like wood dowels to put in the window sashes, I got the chills again. Was the guy trying to hand me a staff or rod to try and tell me to put it in the windows? If anyone has info on ghosts in hooded brown robes with a rod or staff, I'd sure like to hear it. An Asian lady friend told me about a house of hers who knew of this kind of thing and called him a guardian angel that somebody has to give you or will to you. My brother-in-law Larry was killed in Vietnam on September 20th, 1970. To say his death left an enormous hole in our lives would be an understatement. To this day, we often speak of him and remember him fondly as a much beloved member of our family. I've always been very close to my eldest sister. She and my brother-in-law were married only 3 years when he died. Having been widowed at age 23, she decided to remain on her own and live in the house they had recently purchased. Thus began my frequent visits to stay the nights on the weekends and keep her company. One night, not quite 2 years after Larry's death, we had both been in bed for less than half an hour. I was 15 years old. My sister was 25 at the time. Neither one of us had ever had any type of encounter that we considered out of the ordinary, but this one night would change that. As we began to doze off after our customary chatting between rooms, I slept in our spare room directly across the hallway from our bedroom with our doors open. We both clearly heard footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, not a dozen feet down the hallway from where we slept. The footsteps sounded like someone was wearing heavy, leather boots, and when they reached the carpet in the hallway, the footsteps naturally silenced a bit, with only the sound of heady padding and an occasional creak to give away the fact that they were still coming down the hall. While this was happening, my sister called out from her room and asked if I could hear that, and I answered her immediately that I could. By this time, the covers of the bed were securely over my head. There was no way I wanted to see what was going to soon pass by my door, or worse, maybe into my room. The next thing I knew, my sister was reporting a nearly opaque, adult-sized mist forming in her room, just opposite her bed in front of her dark pine closet doors. The moon was full that night, so there was just enough light filtering through her shutters to softly illuminate the room so she could clearly see what was happening. Although I was nearly sweating with fear, I still asked what the mist was doing, of course hoping in part that it would not float my way. Apparently, it hovered for a bit in front of her closet doors, then floated around the bed to the other side of the room before it began to dissipate. Her dog, who slept in her room and would bark at the smallest of unfamiliar sounds, never awoke. Needless to say, we slept little for the remainder of the night. Still, we were convinced that Larry had returned for a visit. After that incident, while she never received such a visit again, my sister did have a lampshade that would repeatedly turn askew during the day while she was at work. The lampshade was rectangular in shape, so it was easy to spot when someone twisted it around. I witnessed this myself. We would go to bed at night, only to find the shape askew again in the morning. This went on in spurts, off and on, until she sold the house and moved nearly 8 years after the night of the footsteps. The shade was twisted tightly down. An earthquake couldn't jar it loose unless the lamp fell completely to the floor. The lamp itself stayed perfectly stationary, only the shade was twisted. We always thought this was Larry's less scary way of letting us know he was still around. The day my sister moved into her new home, the lampshade never twisted askew again. A few days ago, I was sitting on my bed in a small room that has a side window. I turned on my computer and started listening to music. Everything was okay until suddenly, I saw a human shadow through the window. It was just a shadow, yet I could make out the head and the body. There were no hands or legs. It disappeared after 5 seconds, and I was shocked. I turned on the light and ran down to find out who it might be. And you know what? My yard was empty. I looked around for a few minutes, then I came back home. I still didn't know who or what it was. But that wasn't all. That night, I went to bed around 11 p.m. I had just fallen asleep when I suddenly woke up and felt frozen. I couldn't move. Something was pushing my body and I was hurting. After a few minutes of being frozen, I then felt like I was about to blow up. I got out of my bed and I was breathing hard. I had no idea what was happening. Then, I heard some strange sounds from my kitchen. It sounded like chewing sounds. I ran down my kitchen, turned on the light, and there was nothing down there. Around midnight, I was freaking out, so I called my friend to come to my house. When he drove up, I saw a girl in a white dress and with long hair standing next to the gatehouse. I felt scared, and I screamed to my friend, "Hey, watch your back." Just then, the figure disappeared. My friend saw it as well, and he was more frightened than I was. He said the shadow had been right next to him. The figure looked like a 20-year-old girl with a white face, but also Vietnamese. It was extremely unusual. We sat next to the bed until morning. The next day, I invited another friend to come over and take some pictures, but nothing happened that day or the day after. I think the ghost just visited the house to make us look horrible and to scare us a little bit. Isn't that what ghosts do? Thanks for reading. When I got back from Vietnam, I went to live with my mother in Chicago. Chicago is where I was born and lived all my life. My encounter happened either in 1968 or 1969. My mother had a summer home in northern Illinois and would go there every weekend. So I would be home in our third-floor apartment every weekend by myself. I would usually fall asleep on our front room couch watching TV. One night, I woke up somewhere in the middle of the night and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked through the doorway, going into the kitchen, a transparent short-haired or bald man or boy ran out from our pantry, looked me straight in the eye, almost like he hesitated for a split second, then ran into the gas stove area and disappeared. The look in his eyes was like someone being startled or caught doing something wrong. It was so real that when he ran closely by me, I kind of moved back, like if someone is going to bump into you. It all happened so fast, and I was in the process of waking up, so it didn't really hit me as to what just happened or what I just saw. I just continued to the sink for my glass of water. Mind you, this all took place in seconds. As I turned on the water and filled my glass and started to drink, it then hit me. Wow, I stopped. I was just in a little shock. I was frightened. Then I thought maybe some intruder was in the house, but no. This figure ran right into the stove and disappeared. And this figure was semi-transparent. Needless to say, I was afraid. I thought that maybe because I saw him, he would kill me in my sleep. so I couldn't tell anyone. I stayed up half the night and finally did fall asleep. 1 or 2 years later, I found out that the landlord's son had died in our house. I don't know what floor or exactly when or how, but I do know it was before my encounter. My mother moved out of the house, and I got married and went on with my wife. I never went back there to see if I could find a picture of the landlord's son. For many years, I thought about it and wished that I would have gone back, but now it's too late. This was over 40 years ago now. I'm somewhat of an artist, not very good, but I did draw a face picture of my encounter. I don't know what happened to that picture. The vision that I have of him is vivid in my mind to this day. Maybe I should try to draw another picture. And that's my story. In my senior year of high school, the Vietnam conflict was still going on, and I had a pen pal who was over there. At lunchtime, I would leave the school and go over to a small church located a block from the school and sit in there and pray that my pen pal was okay. One day, I was leaving the church to go back to school, and I noticed a very old 1950s car across the street. There was a man standing outside of the car, and a very young boy playing with the wheel. The boy looked to be about 5 to 6 years old. As I was walking out, the man beckoned to me across from the street. When I got there, the man said that the man looked too old to have a son that age, wants to know why I went into that church. I smiled and said, to pray for the end of the Vietnam conflict. The man told me some things that were personal, then stated that the conflict would end soon, but another will start. I smiled and walked about 10 to 20 feet and looked back. There was no car, no one around. I was close enough that I would have heard the engine start and see the car go away, but nothing. Way back in the 70s, when our neighborhood wasn't very occupied and only a few houses were around, my aunt, one of my sisters and my mom, was left alone in our spooky, dark, and silent house. She was left playing in one of our living rooms where a lot of spiritual activity happens. Suddenly, she could hear footsteps coming from the ceiling, hard and loud footsteps that seemed to linger right above where she was playing at. Chills crept up her spine, and she began to move away, but the footsteps and banging just kept following her wherever she went. Even when she was running and screaming, the steps ran and followed her until she finally ran outside to daylight. This story has been validated by my other aunts and uncles, but let me share my own experience. Since my grandfather is a World War II veteran, he's seen and experienced a lot more than most other people. The whole family believes the spirit protected him through the war, since one of his experiences was running back and forth along the front line in an intense gunfight between Filipino and Japanese troops. He was commanding his troops back then. In any case, fast forward to the year 2004. My whole family was relaxing in our rest house about 40 miles north of this city. The land the house is standing on is cursed. All those who have owned have gone bankrupt. I believe this is true since my grandfather is losing a lot of money to an evil and possibly possessed eldest daughter. My experience happened while falling asleep in his room. Strangely enough, I felt an intense presence within the room, but I didn't feel scared or creeped out, which is something I am prone to feel. The presence just felt safe, but it sure was there, as I could feel it enveloping me. I was half asleep then, and simply fell back into my deep slumber a minute later. I later narrated my experience to my grandfather, and he simply smiled and said, "Yes, it's true." I wasn't born with the ability to see ghosts, unlike most of my maternal family, but I do know when they want to be felt, and I can somewhat read other people's minds and form somewhat of a subconscious link with them while talking or engaging in casual conversation. Another story involves the death of one of our longtime nannies in a spot she loved to sit on during the afternoons. She died of an embolism close to a year ago. One of our maids told us that on the night of her funeral, our maid was cleaning the plates up all alone in the house. Our whole family was in a rest house where the funeral was held, when all of a sudden, the dog started barking rather wildly. She looked out the kitchen window towards the porch where the dogs were barking and could see them looking up at an invisible figure while howling and barking all at the same time. The porch was where our nanny used to sit during the afternoons before she died. The invisible figure soon retreated back into the house, as if retiring for the night. Take note, this all happened at the night of my nanny's funeral, probably visiting one last time before passing on to the other side.
When I was 2 years old, my family and I moved into a quaint little neighborhood in a small city outside of San Antonio, Texas, where I still reside today. It's a quiet place with virtually no crime. In fact, most of the people who live here are retired Air Force families from nearby Randolph. The streets in this neighborhood are named after ancient civilizations and important figures in ancient mythologies. One particular street was named Gothic Drive, after the Gothic tribes which ransacked Rome towards the end of the Great Empire's reign. As one would expect, this street was constructed in a way which mirrored the Goths' macabre reputation, if you will. Trees are planted so close together that sunlight is obscured, and most of the street is blanketed in shadows, even in the middle of the day. The houses on that street, though small, are Victorian in design and are always dimly lit at night. Hedges and lines line the trees, adding to the eeriness and mystique of the street. In spite of the dark aesthetics, I never felt uneasy or disturbed when I walked or drove through this street, until one night when a stranger appeared. The year was 2007. It was a clear, moonlit summer night, and I was driving home from a particularly bad date. Goddamn. The radio was tuned to my favorite station, and my thoughts were geared heavily toward what had happened earlier that evening, of course. As I turned on to Gothic Drive, the beams of my headlights struck something unusual on the other end of the street. Once I got close enough, I was able to make out the figure of a slender woman who was dressed in a black outfit of some sort. Soon I was able to see the figure almost as clearly as I can see the laptop in front of me now. It was a nun. The sight of a nun in my neighborhood was unusual, but not so unusual that I paid much attention to it. I remember shrugging my shoulders and saying to myself, "That's weird," and continuing on with my commute. Then something strange happened. When I looked back to catch another glimpse of her, I saw nothing. She had disappeared. I am a practical and skeptical person, so I initially wrote this incident off as product of the situation that I was in that night. I figured that my heightened emotional state from the bad date had caused my mind to play tricks on me. Why my subconscious chose a nun as a manifestation of my frustration, I could not seem to figure out. Until I realized a few weeks later, during a brisk midnight stroll, that my explanation was dead wrong. It was later in the summer, and I had decided to go out for a late night walk to alleviate some boredom and bum off some energy accumulated in the form of energy drinks. Yeah, I know. It was stupid to drink those kind of drinks so late at night. Give me a break. These late night strolls were part of my nightly routine, thanks to the fact that my neighborhood is relatively safe, and I am usually not the only one out. The neighborhood was quiet that night. Everyone seemed to be in bed, with the exception of one jogger and a few stray cats. And a raccoon. I hate those things. Anyways, I deviated from my usual routine slightly and decided to walk through Gothic Drive. Something I rarely did because it leads to the main road in my neighborhood, and I typically did not like to venture out that far. Tonight was different. I seem to have been emotionally drawn in that direction. The houses on that street were unlit, and the street lamp was off. I slowly made my way toward the end of the street. Suddenly, the street light lit up brilliantly, and there she was, standing in the rays of the lamplight. I was not afraid, not even close to being afraid. It was apparent that she wasn't an ordinary woman, or even from this dimension. Her dress was black. Even the bright light from the lamp above her seemed to be absorbed by her dark ebony remnants. She appeared to float slightly above the ground. It didn't seem to have any feet. For some reason, I could see her face quite clearly, even though I was more than 20 feet away from her. She was a comely woman with dark eyes and soft crimson lips. She was smiling. I walked towards her, shouting "Howdy" or something to that effect. The nun didn't move or speak. As I approached her, I blinked once. She vanished. I was in shock. Had I really seen a ghost? Was my imagination playing tricks on me? Then, a terrible thought hit my mind. Was I hallucinating? I have a history of mental health problems, yes, depression, different anxiety disorders, and I knew that schizophrenia can cause one to lose touch with reality and even have hallucinations. Was I going nuts? My fears were relieved when I found out that I'm not the only one who has seen the nuns. My brother told me he saw her one night while driving home from night classes at a local community college. Many of the neighbors I've talked to say that they've encountered her on different occasions. They told me that her facial expressions tend to reflect the moods of those who cross her path. If you're angry, she will have an angry expression on her face. If you're happy, she will smile. And so on. The mystery of the ghostly nun fascinated me, but my focus soon shifted away from her when school started up again. I did not think much of her for several months after that. Then, one night, I saw her again. This time, things were way different. I had stormed out of the house after a vicious verbal exchange with my mother over something absolutely stupid and trivial. I'm not going to get into it. I had no intention of returning home until after my mom had gone to bed, so I decided to take a long walk, which meant going down the main road. To access the road, I turned onto Gothic Drive. I did not expect to see the mysterious nun, but sure enough, there she was. She stood under the street lamp, looking straight at me. I could see her face from where I stood. She was not smiling this time. I could feel hatred and pure anger emanating from her. The expression on her face was beyond menacing. It seemed as if she was ready to lunge at me and rip my heart out. Her eyes were dark and piercing. She knew what had transpired in my home after a few minutes prior. This time, I was afraid. Deathly afraid. I turned around and ran home as fast as I could, looking back occasionally to make sure the woman wasn't following me. When I finally reached home, I locked the door and apologized to my mom for starting the fight earlier. I told her what I saw, and she forgave me and helped me calm down a bit. My frightening encounter happened in February 2008. I've not seen the nun since, and frankly, I don't even want to see her again. This experience has certainly turned my skepticism of the paranormal on its head. Prior to these last few experiences, I'd never seen anything that I could not explain through logic. I certainly have a more open mind when it comes to the paranormal. You better believe it. And I still wonder about the nun from time to time. Who is she? Why is she wandering the streets of a suburban town? How is she able to sense our emotions and reflect them back at us? I may never know.
Long story short, recent breakup, very distraught, cried out for help, felt abandoned by everyone, and finally fell asleep. Around 3:30 in the morning, I wake up to go to the bathroom and realize I'm completely paralyzed. I can't move except turn my head from side to side. I can't speak. I feel like I'm sinking deeper into the bed. After watching the clock for about 30 minutes, I decided to try again and can't get up. I'm scared because I have no control over my body. My mind is clear though. I'm not dreaming. I'm wide awake. Next thing I remember is a man in a black suit. His face is a black void. He's standing on the side of my bed. I know I would be terrified, but I'm not. Strangely, everything about him was pleasing. Creepy, but pleasing. He didn't speak, but somehow I knew he wanted me to go with him, to take his hand and go with him. That's when I looked away. At the foot of my bed are 3 monks. No faces, just brown robes. Every time I tried to get up to go with this man, it felt as if the monks were pushing me back down. This went on for about an hour. I just kept trying to get up and go with him, and the monks kept pushing me back down. Eventually, I quit looking at the man. I refused to look at him. When I finally got the courage to turn and check the time, the man was gone. I looked at the foot of my bed, and the monks were gone. Only then was I able to get up. A couple of years later, I had a near-death experience. Has anyone seen a man in a black suit, or monks, all without faces? Back in May, I moved into an upstairs apartment. At first I experienced nothing out of the ordinary. Then I met my downstairs neighbors, and that was when things started to get very strange. The first thing that I noticed was being so tired after I got home from work that I literally would come home and fall into a deep sleep. The first time that happened, I had someone stole money from me. At the same time my neighbor's electric was about to be off. The amount of the bill was $120, which is the exact same amount that was stolen from me. Next, things went from very strange to downright creepy, as in like a haunting. Not things moving around as much as pictures being drawn on my floors and walls. This individual had me believing that he was Satan and that he was my guardian angel from the beginning of time. I found that very hard to believe. I began communicating with what appeared to be a spirit. I asked him questions, and he would grab my head and shake it yes or nod it very lightly. I moved out last month, but my neighbors are still with me. Now, I live with my friend, more than 20 minutes away. There's a symbol of Satan on their flat screen TV. I can grab this entity with my hands and stab it to the wood floor. Sounds incredible, huh? I can see him in the air, where he is floating around. And the house is warm, and it's also distorted, like when you look at a barbecue grill. My question is, how do I make him go away? Is there a way to block his energy from me? Any advice would be welcome. I googled projecting yourself from your body. That is how I found out about astral projection. I've been having these bizarre, terrifying experiences on and off for almost 20 years, but most frequently in the past 5 years or so. This week it has happened to me 3 times, and although it never occurred to me before to do any research on the internet, my sister suggested it, and the first link I looked at brought me here, to another woman's story. I was astonished to find that her experience was almost identical to my own, and now I'm bursting with curiosity about it. Maybe someone out there will read this and will be able to give me some sort of explanation. It always happens when I'm in bed, either just as I'm drifting into the sleep state, or later at night when something awakens me and I begin to fall back asleep. I always think that I am awake when it begins, but now I'm not so sure. I feel like I'm awake, feel like I'm in my body, and then suddenly I am not in control. It didn't used to happen this way. But for the past few months, anytime it happens, it begins with a ringing in my ears that rapidly grows louder. The ringing is so unpleasant. It's like a super high-pitched monotone. This is accompanied by a sudden sensation of floating or weightlessness. The floating sensation is actually nice. It feels free, and sometimes I get the feeling that I just need to let go and let it happen. But I don't ever seem to be able to do it because it quickly becomes very scary. Always with these episodes, I have the sensation that something or someone is there and taking control of me. Perhaps that's just my mind's interpretation. I don't really believe in malevolent entities, but it's a powerful sensation. The floating feeling feels like something is taking me away. I don't know how else to explain it. Taking me away or trapping me, and immediately I have an overpowering urge to fight it. That's where the paralysis part comes in. I get terrified at this point because I feel myself as floating, and sometimes I actually do move around. I'll be carried off of my bed or through a wall into another room, and the whole time I'm struggling against it. I feel like I'm under 100 feet of water, or like I have chains around me. I try to move my arms and legs, and I can't, or if I manage to do so, it's with an incredible lethargy, and it's so slow, so feeble, that it's useless. Sometimes I try to shout or scream, and I can't make any sound come out. Other times, I've literally tried to throw my body around, so that doesn't really work either. Generally, I struggle for some period of time, and then suddenly I'm opening my eyes for real, and in my bed, right where I started, and I'm always shocked to find that I haven't moved and the world hasn't ended. This has happened to me so many times now that I can recognize it when it happens. Even as it is happening, I'm telling myself that it's not real, and I just need to wake up, even though I feel like I'm fully awake. This is definitely not a dream, and not the normal dream state. It feels 100% real and physical, and I remember every episode so vividly, all the way back to the first one when I was 17 years old. I don't know what to make of it. I was stunned when I read the other woman's account. It is several years old at this point, and saw that she described these exact same sensations. Many people had comments about being an out-of-body experience or the beginnings of one, and this is something that had never occurred to me before, but I suppose it all makes sense now. My questions are, why does something that I would think would be a fascinating experience feel so negative and terrifying? As I've said, some part of me always does have this urge to let go and not struggle, and tells me that everything really is okay, and I should just go with it. But every time I try, I just feel like there is something, or this someone, a very negative something, trying to do something to me, and I always end up fighting against it. I know I'm probably opening a big can of worms by putting this out here and asking for opinions, but my curiosity now, after reading some other people's experiences, is too strong to resist. Can anyone give me any idea what's going on? And if this really is me attempting to have an OBE, why does it feel so terrible? And how can I let go and have a positive experience? Thank you so much for reading. About a week and a half ago, I was sleeping next to my boyfriend, and about 4:30 a.m., I woke up to use the bathroom and play a little bit of my RPG game on my iPhone. When I was done, I turned off the lights and slept on my stomach. I held my boyfriend with my left arm. I couldn't sleep. My eyes opened in the dark, even though they were shut. At this point, I leaned up, still on my tummy, and looked at the clock. 5:08 a.m. I looked at my boyfriend, and then he was gone. At this point, I knew exactly what was happening. I was astral projecting. I knew I astraled at this point, but I didn't want to deal with this. I've always astraled by accident, so I slept back down on my stomach. At this point, I felt continuous tugging, and I turned to my right. We slept on the floor, and I'm on the wall side. A sparkly, glittery, blue human with arms, heads, legs was pulling me. It was even on its knees on my legs. I was scared. I said, "Oh my God, please, you're ruining my sleep. Stop." My eyes shift from reality to spirit realm. Finally, I got back. I told my boyfriend. It was like 5:30 a.m. Anyways, I googled someone in the psychic experience site and said, imagine a human glass vase filled with glitter and blue static people. So, I was like shocked. I'm not alone. It was baby blue, white, little pink, lavender, sparkly as hell. Thing is, no one died around me, so I didn't even know what it was or what it wanted. I joined this site to see if any more people can give me answers of what these spirits are. Thank you. For as long as I can recall, music has been a big aspect in my life as far as my emotional state. It has this way of invoking emotion in a way quite like nothing else can compare to. One thing I always wanted to learn was the piano, which up until recently, I haven't been able to play as well as I wanted to. I guess it was this aspect of how much you want something versus how much you imagine it that led me to the current situation. I'd often imagine myself playing some musical instrument while listening to some song in my memory that eventually and accidentally start to project itself to the point that I can hear it in the friggin' sky. As much as I try to focus on somehow keeping it in my own mind, it just so happens to manifest outward into the real world. Now, I apologize if anyone has heard music in this sense, as it may be my fault and I'm still working on containing said abilities. It's to the point now where anything I imagine sometimes projects outward, which I'm not sure if it's normal or not. One of my favorite things to imagine or project are thought experiments involving my favorite topic, astrophysics. I can picture exactly how the universe works and have written a formula on how time itself theoretically works, which solves Einstein's theory of relativity. It's an ongoing thing which I've developed over time, with the first part of it, as I recall, happening in the 6th grade. I was explaining to my teacher that you could go from point A to point B, being any distance apart, and that the only thing that was a factor was velocity. He said that there was a problem. You'd break every bone in your body under acceleration, and said he'd love to read a book about it someday. Time volume theory, basically time itself, is a whole separate thing when spoken in relation to the universe. Time, from my perspective, is more of a volume than a numerical scale which moves one way. Einstein's theory needed space-time to be infinite, but due to the tools he had available, was unable to prove it definitively. Mine proposed that time is not infinite, as it has to have a start and an end. Otherwise, there's no way to tell how much time has elapsed. Time which is finite, over the universe which is infinite, by space which is just a container, equals relativity of 3 parts, your observational time span, over time variables which are mass density, mass velocity, and gravitational field, over an observed object's time span. A big aspect of today's current astrophysic view on the cosmos says that space is expanding, which doesn't take a few things into account, primarily distance measured using redshift techniques. It measures via the star's luminosity, but in a way that proposes light travels in a straight line. When you factor in that line has to go through dark matter and the warping of space around mass, that its trajectory path is curved, it would cancel out the aspect of space expanding, and most likely would show that space is static with dynamic objects that move within its environment. A lot of what I learned over the years as a result of my passion for astrophysics came from Isaac Asimov books, encyclopedias, and documentaries such as The Universe on History Channel. The rest has come from pure thought experiments in my head where I can imagine a set of conditions within a specific environment and simply imagine the outcome of the situation due to my scientific, electrical, and mechanical aptitudes. A few years back, when I first started to learn about my psychic ability, the first thing I did was explore deeper into the realm of my imagination, which led me to some amazing discoveries, in addition to many theories on how life in the universe worked. In theory, of course. I definitely look forward to future experiences as I hone my abilities and push myself to explore new horizons, with the only limitation being those I impose on myself. Thanks for reading. I found myself at church as every week. I hadn't slept at all the night before, but all in all, I felt fine walking in and sitting down. A few minutes pass. I drink my coffee and I wait for the music to start. The band begins playing, and I relax into my chair a bit, with this strange feeling starting to overwhelm me. The best way I can describe it is that I was distancing from everything and everyone around me, and there was this extreme pain growing centered in between my eyebrows, along with this extreme warmth. I felt shaky and weak, and this pull was growing. I knew that I could resist it if I wanted to, but I chose not to, for the sake of seeing what would happen. It was almost as if I was being pulled to my left and forward, not physically, but mentally. The pain in between my eyebrows split, and started to move to slightly above my temples, on each side of my head. As the mental pull got stronger, the pain from my temples began to grow. Everything around me felt far off. I was watching from a third-person perspective as I stood over my body, which was still lounging in the chair. The area around me and my body was an expanse of gray, and I could see the silhouettes of the people who were sitting beside me off in the horizon. I was alone in this expanse of gray, floating beside my physical body, just watching myself. I watched and felt horns start to tear out of my physical body's skin. The pain was intense and overwhelming throughout this entire process. The horns continued to slowly grow. As I watched solemnly, an orb appeared about 6 feet in front of my physical body. The orb itself was translucent, with a slight golden sheen, but it held in it a liquid of yellow and white that I could only describe as liquid light. The orb slowly floated over to me until it was about 3 feet above my physical body. It floated there for a moment before the liquid inside the orb was released to flow down into my face. As soon as the liquid came in contact with the horns growing on my head, the horns melted as if they were made of metal. The liquid light relinquished the pain I'd been experiencing as soon as it touched my face. The metal that used to be my horns fused with the liquid light, and they slowly moved down my back together and pooling as one at my shoulder blades. Extreme warmth followed by excruciating pain as the metal liquid launched off my back, forming jagged metal bones like those of bird wings. I felt hurt but confused and also enlightened at the same time. I slowly felt myself drifting back into my body, and I felt physically ill and weak. I felt like I just went 3 rounds in a ring with a professional boxer. I haven't really ever been a religious person before. This was my 3rd time going to church, and I don't know what to take from this. I know this last bit isn't astral projected related, but I feel it is relevant to the story. The day after this happened, I was meditating, and I had this image of a masculine figure with the metal wing bones I had. I knew he was me, but he looked hurt. He was sitting up, and there was dirt all over the metal bones. Then there was a flicker of blue light, and there were these tendrils of light extending down from the bones where feathers would have been on normal wings. The tendrils of light slowly undulated, as if they were seaweed floating underwater. Thank you for reading. Last night I had a very vivid, multi-sensory lucid dream. After a few minutes the visitor left. They dematerialized or whooshed away off my right-hand side. With it came a sound I've heard before. It was a very quick but drawn-out note or chord that seemed to become louder before disappearing. Previously, I've had experiences when meditating of a person's light body entering through the crown of my head with a similar but lower and uncomfortable noise until they are in and around me. They then proceeded to communicate through hand signals and images and gestures they made with my body. When they left, there was a similar sound, but much louder, and I felt the being pulling away. It is almost as if a whole person is sucked into a vortex like manna down a plug hole. Once the last of the form disappears, the noise ceases. Last night, when the visitor appeared, I said yes to it, in that I had a conversation with the person. We were face to face. It was therefore unlike the full body takeover described above. It was a two-way conversation, and I could feel their physical body too. Then they left with a whoosh. Was I receiving an astral visitation from someone projecting directly to me? Does this low, quick, pulling noise sound familiar to anyone? If so, Is this typical when being visited by someone performing astral projection? Thank you in advance for your input, advice, and guidance. I see these visitations. They're not infrequent, but this is the most recent as benign. I've no fear associated with them. I would just like to know what type of experience this is, and whether the sound is somehow characteristic. I feel kinda silly writing this, since I haven't talked much about it since it happened. I'm 17 now, and still can't come up with any explanation other than spirits. I've always been a believer, and hope to one day have my own encounter with ghosts. I never thought it would be as terrifying as it was. 8 years ago, summer of 2000, my dad's family was having a reunion, and we all decided we would stay at Oak Island Beach in North Carolina. I'm not sure if that is the exact name. I know it was something to do with oak in it. The week we were there, the weather was very fickle. It rained most days, and the sun was only out 3 or 4 times. Most of our time was spent indoors. My parents, sister, and grandparents shared one condo. My dad's brother and sister and her family shared another, and his step-siblings were in the third with their children. One night, while it was storming, my cousin Josh and I went to the condo to play video games and watch TV. Everyone else was in our condo, playing cards and drinking. We played Dino Crisis and an X-Men game, and decided to watch cartoons after about an hour. We spent another couple of hours just goofing off, when the storm really started picking up. We were sitting on the couch, talking and laughing, when we heard a creak on the balcony outside. Neither of us is scared easily now, and we weren't then either. I looked out of the sliding doors, but everything was pitch black. We went back to our conversation and had no interruptions for a couple of minutes. When a bolt of lighting lit up the beach, we saw a man standing on the balcony, dressed in a trench coat. He seemed to be looking out at the sea. It all happened so suddenly. We didn't believe what we saw, no matter how skeptical we were. We weren't about to go and check like I had with the noise. After a couple of minutes, we noticed the door was fogging up. Not the entire thing, just a little patch, about 6 feet off of the floor. We were very spooked now. During the next bolt of lightning, we both saw the man standing against the door, looking in on us. He screamed, and I screamed, and we jumped over the couch, headed for the door. We yanked it open, and as we did, we heard the sound of glass breaking. We didn't look back, just ran across the parking lot to the other condo. When we came in, we were soaked and out of breath. Our parents started to freak, asking us what was wrong. When I told them, they just laughed and brushed it off. We kept begging them to call someone, but they refused. After about a minute, they got fed up with it. They grabbed us and their umbrellas and dragged us over there. When we went in, the place was just as we left it. The door was intact, and no one was on the balcony, not even a footprint. I know I didn't imagine it. I believe that the spirit was drawn to me for some reason. My cousin has had no other experiences that he has told me about, and I've had quite a few, but none as intense as the first. Anyone that has had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. Finding the site has opened my eyes to the world of ghosts and those that have been affected by them. Thanks. My Aunt Terry, from my father's side, lived in Oklahoma. When I was about 16, she came here to Memphis, and she told me about a house that she lived in. She said that when her husbands and kids moved in, there was a barn out back, and she said when she walked in there
there was an upside down pentacle on the barn floor. After she saw that, she never went back out there. One night, when everyone went to bed, my Aunt Terry heard the dogs barking in the kitchen. She went into the kitchen and watched her dog bark at a corner in the room. The next night she went to bed, and the TV in the living room came on by itself, and she said it did it every night. So one night, she decided to unplug the TV, and she went to bed as normal, and the TV still came on. Then another day, after everyone ate dinner, they were all sitting in the living room. My aunt looked out the window and saw a pair of red eyes. Her husband saw them too, and it really freaked them out. On yet another night, my aunt and uncle and the kids were leaving to go see a movie, and on the porch stood a beast with red eyes, and half his body was human, but the rest of him was like an animal. She described his hands and feet as hoofs. Well, after they got home that night, my aunt and uncle made the kids sleep with them, and Catherine started to get really sick. When my aunt and uncle tried to take her to the hospital, the car wouldn't start, so they had to push the car all the way down the street, and it started right up. The doctors couldn't find out what was wrong with Catherine. My aunt and uncle decided to move, and every morning the car wouldn't start when my aunt had to go to work, until my uncle pushed it down the street. After my aunt and uncle found a new place to live, when they got everything they owned out of the house, Catherine got better immediately, and the car never gave them a problem, and the TV never came on by itself again. Some strange occurrences, but I swear they're true. Thanks for reading. The Hampton Inn on Warner Road, off Route 279, has a haunted room, which is number 417. My husband stayed in this room while on a business trip in March 2008. He frequently stays at this hotel while in Maryland, but never had an experience like this until he stayed in room 417. This was his room for 3 nights, and for the first 2 nights, he was very restless and didn't sleep well, which was not a normal occurrence for him. On the 3rd restless night, he realized that he was hearing noises inside the room, not from adjoining rooms. These noises were hangers moving around in the closet, the refrigerator door opening, noises from the bathroom, and the sound of glass being set on the nightstand next to the bed. Final thing that really spooked him was that something grabbed his side as he laid on the bed, trying to ignore the sounds and fall asleep. He was not imagining any of this. He could still feel the sensation of his side after jumping out of bed. He looked around the room and checked the deadbolt lock on the door, and all was secure. He considered packing and checking out, but it was 3 a.m. He finally fell asleep and checked out the next morning. He has since stayed at the hotel and was offered the same room upon check-in, but he refused it. The hotel clerk wanted to know why, but he didn't want to sound foolish and wouldn't elaborate on his experience. For the record, he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits until this happened. We believe that someone must have died in this room, heart attack or something, and their spirit is trapped there. We dare anyone to stay in this room. It is creepy. Last year, I was living in an apartment on the far northwest side of town in Chicago, Illinois, and had one experience in an apartment that for the most part was pretty quiet, but for this experience. I lived in a frighteningly active apartment on the northeast side before this occurrence, so this didn't really totally freak me out, but I was sitting in my living room on the couch reading. The sun was reflecting through the blinds, which I halfway closed, and the TV, which was directly in front of me,
and perhaps 8 to 10 feet away, was off. I sat reading for quite some time, and at one point looked up and into my reflection on the TV screen. Sitting a few inches from me was a woman with a pageboy hairdo, perhaps in her early 40s, with glasses on. I could see her curves as she sat, so there was no mistake that she was a woman. I turned instantly to my left side, irrationally expecting to see someone sitting next to me in my lockdown apartment where I knew no one but myself had been the entire day. No one was there, of course. I looked back into the TV reflection again, and she was no longer there. May I point out that there was absolutely nothing in that apartment that could have made such a reflection. I was on the second story, so there was nothing inside that could have reflected that way, no nearby trees, etc. It was a bona fide experience. There was this one terrifying experience, though, that has haunted me ever since while being in that apartment. I was sitting in the bathroom, doing my business, as usual. I left the door open because I felt very uncomfortable with the door closed. I don't know why, it just gave me that feeling. I saw that same lady, early 40s style, with the pageboy hairdo, right outside the door. It was like she was fixated on me, and she appeared momentarily, just staring at me. Although the bathroom light was obviously on, the hallway outside the door was pretty dim, so you could just barely make out the outline of her face and her body. There were some slight changes with her this time. The only difference being this time was that she looked like she was in some kind of nun outfit. It was really creepy. This was the moment where I was terrified. I didn't know what to think. She kind of looked like Mother Teresa in a way. It also looked like she was trying to open her mouth, but somehow couldn't, like she was unable to speak or something. Maybe she was in danger. Just like that, she disappeared. And later on in that day, I also saw an orb float around. It was pretty eerie. For the record, this was a highly Polish neighborhood, and had been for years, so I have a feeling it was some old Polish lady that couldn't leave her building. I lived there for a year, and am now gone. I also have a theory that because she is Polish, that she was wearing the nun attire due to her religion. You see, Polish people are Roman Catholics usually, so it all made sense to me at the time when I thought about it. Thanks for reading. I had a personal experience at this bed and breakfast, and it was so exciting. A friend of mine and I were staying in this B&B, the Henderson House, while we visited her daughter at a nearby Baptist university where she is a cheerleader. We stayed in the downstairs guest bedroom by the dining room. When we arrived, they were setting up for a big sit-down dinner and reception with round tables covered in white tablecloths. It was a big affair that went on for a while we were at a football game. When we arrived back at the B&B later that night, it was late, and the staff was cleaning up and putting up the tables. They apologized for making so much noise, and said that they'd be finishing up for the next hour or so, washing the tablecloths and putting them away. We were exhausted, so we each took a shower, and my friend crawled into this beautiful mahogany bed, and I pulled out the sleeper sofa and settled in and watched TV for a little while. Finally, it quieted down somewhat out in the parlor, so we turned off the lights and immediately fell asleep. I woke up some time earlier as 3 women in gowns brushed by my bed, carrying things. We had gotten quite friendly with the innkeeper and her staff earlier, so I really didn't think that much about it, and wondered why they had put things away in our room before morning. The next morning, I asked my friend what the women were doing in our room the night before. She said, "What women? No one came in here," and she motioned towards the door where the deadbolt was still locked. She went out to the dining room for breakfast a little before I did, and as I was walking out into the hall, she walked up to me and said, "Come here, the owner has something to tell you." When I walked into the kitchen, the owner looked up and said, "So, you saw them, huh?" I told her I saw 3 women in gowns, and she said, "They are dressed in wedding and bridesmaid dresses." She then walked into the parlor and opened the big old photo album and turned to the page that showed a wedding party lined up on the staircase. It was them. They are seen from time to time getting ready for a ceremony, and the bedroom where we stayed at was once a porch that leads around to the front of the house. Because it is a Baptist college, they don't promote these ghost stories, as the college frowns on it. But she said many people see them. There is also a ghost of a captain, Army or Sea, I didn't quite get. But he haunts an upstairs room with a big bay window and is seen often too. It was not a frightening thing. I loved it, in fact, and hoped to go back again. They were not see-through people, and had I reached out, I could have touched their dresses. Maybe. In the year 2000, my husband and I moved to LaGrange, Georgia, to a fairly new apartment on Old Airport Road. His job had transferred him from New Hampshire, and he was able to be on a 5-day shift, 5 on and 5 off. That meant he would not be home every other week, as he was a truck driver for a major store chain. Anyway, after being there a month or so, we decided that it was a great little town to settle down in, and began looking for a house. During this time, we had no incidents at the apartment. After another 2 months of searching, we finally found the house we wanted. It was a 3-bedroom ranch with a small in-ground pool located in a rural part of LaGrange. When our offer was accepted, we were ecstatic. This is when my 4-year-old son began falling out of bed at night, something he had neither done before or after living at this apartment. Eventually, this led him to waking up in the middle of the night, and I would have to go in and confront him, which was usually fairly easy to do, and he'd go back to sleep, only to wake up later again in the night. When I put them to bed, I would sit in the hallway between both of their doors. Daughter's bedroom was at the end of the hall, which was about 10 feet long, but their doors were close together. I would have all the lights off, except the hallway, and once they were asleep, I'd go and get on the PC in the dining room, adjacent to their hallway. This hallway had a bathroom at the opposite end of the bedrooms, and a laundry closet, where my washing machine were. One night, my son insisted I lay with him in bed, so I laid down behind him, closest to his closet, with him closest to the door. My eyes were closed, and we were both resting quietly, when suddenly he half sat up in bed and said, "Who is that?" Naturally, I asked, "What do you mean?" He said a woman in a long skirt just walked by his bedroom door and headed to his sister's room. Of course, this is the week my husband's gone, so I'm alone in the apartment, thinking someone must have broken into our second-floor apartment. So I got up and looked. My daughter, who is 9 years old, thankfully was sound asleep, so I checked her room, closet, and under her bed to make sure no one was in there. I questioned my son again, and he said no one passed back by his door, and there's no exit from my daughter's room, just right by my son's room. I brought both kids to sleep in my bed on the other side of the apartment that night. Another night, I sat in the hall again until they were both asleep. Now keep in mind, all the lights are off except the hall, which includes their big walk-in closets. No lights on. When they were both sleeping, I got up and used their bathroom at the end of their hall. While in there, I heard what sounded like a toy hitting the wall in my son's closet, which shared a wall with the bathroom. Thinking that he woke up and started playing, which was not like him at all. By the way, I went to his room to find him sleeping cozily, but the closet door halfway open and the light inside open. Okay, so now I'm freaked out because I know that the door was closed and the light was off, and yes, his bed's right next to that closet. So yeah, I took them into my room again. Again, on another night, my son wakes up again, but this time my husband's home and we're all asleep in our own beds. I can hear my son crying, so I go to comfort him, but he's not there. My husband and I can't find him, but he's still crying, sobbing, a terrified cry actually. In a minute or two, we find him hiding under the sink in the bathroom at the end of his hallway. He told us the mean lady won't let him pass. He had tried to come in our room, but she stood in front of him. Again, he described her exactly the same. Long skirt, hair up behind her head, and she makes faces at him. Now I know for a fact I'm dealing with a ghostie here, but husband thinks I'm just going nuts and putting stories in the kid's head. My daughter, meanwhile, never notices any of this and is not disturbed. While on the computer one night, late around 2 a.m., I hear 3 distinct loud knocks under my feet. One on the left in the small kitchen, one directly below my feet, and one to my right. Sounded like someone downstairs used a broom to knock on the ceiling in extremely rapid succession. I sincerely doubt that anyone can move as quickly in the downstairs apartment and get by the furniture they undoubtedly had there, just as I had mine arranged. I know for a fact the lady and her kids were in bed by 10 at night. So the bank has decided that they will give us a loan on any house in Lagrange, except that one, because it's rural, so we try another place and another. One night, I'm sleeping, and have a more vivid than any other dream I've ever had, kind of like a dream nightmare. In it, we live in the house, and I'm looking for my son, only to find him floating face down in the pool. I woke up crying and made up my mind that there's no way I'm ever moving into the house. So now I must convince hubby, who thinks I'm nuts anyway, and is determined to get to that house. Well, having bought a puppy when we started looking for a house, this collie is now almost fully grown size, but he still has accidents, so we keep him penned in the kitchen with a large baby gate. When we go out, this doggy somehow gets past the gate by pushing a corner or whatever, and is running around our apartment. So one night, we're going out to dinner, and hubby and I lock up Poochie and set 2 high back dining chairs against the gate. Keep in mind, our apartment is carpet, thick and plush everywhere, except the kitchen. When we return, Puppy is looking at me from my kid's hallway, and the gate is still exactly as we left it, and the chairs are too. Not one thing had moved, but somehow, according to Lovey Hubby, I'm supposed to believe the dog vaulted over the chair backs and somehow landed without killing himself or breaking my dining room table, which was a mere foot or 2 from the chairs. Yeah, okay. My downstairs neighbor's kids told me that their mom was upset because I let my kids run around my apartment, banging at all hours of the night, mostly after 10 p.m., and she can't believe I let my kids stay up so late. She has to get up early, yada yada yada. Except, my kids are in bed every night at 9 o'clock, and asleep no later than 9:30ish. I see a shape leaning out of the kitchen door, watching me as I watch TV and tell it, "Come sit by me," and leave my son alone. It didn't sit with me, but it didn't bother my son that night. I never noticed my dog noticing anything. The only cold spot in the house was the kids' hallway, and not always, just mostly. Hubby slept in son's room one day, in the afternoon, and, even though we had central air, complained that he sweat like a hog, and had the worst nightmares ever. But the place still isn't haunted, and yes, he steadfastly refused to ever sleep in there again. I saw blinds move on their own, doorknobs that rattled when I was alone, in the place. And no, it wasn't a teeny shake caused by some truck rumbling by, which was there some 50 to 100 feet between the side of our apartment and the road. This was a defined and voracious shaking, a definitive hello, I'm trying to open the door. But no one in the apartment but me. Finally, my husband grew tired of trying to get a loan for that house, and mysteriously, everything stopped. No more rattling of this or that, no shadows, but by now, it is also true that the four of us were sleeping in my waterbed, in the one room that never seemed affected by the haunting. But I noticed everything in the apartment changed and felt cozy again. But by then, I'd also decided that tornadoes, large cockroachy looking bugs, and the ghost belt were too much for me, and we packed up and came back north. Interestingly enough, when we returned home to my parents' house, which we later bought, which has never ever felt anything but perfect there were 3 knocks on the bottom half of my bedroom door one afternoon. I was alone in the house. Immediately, I felt that was the spirit or something, telling us we made the right choice by not getting the house. My father believed that it was his mother who had lived and died in North Carolina, who knew something bad would happen to my son if we bought that house, especially since it all seemed to stop when we stopped trying to get financing for it and gave up on the house. My son has never been affected by any other ghosty type stuff since then, and he's never fell out of bed again either. Feel free to email me if you choose. While I was working at a hospital in town, I had the opportunity to come in contact with many ghosts. I worked on the geriatric floor, and elderly people died there every day. If the power suddenly went out and immediately came back on, a person had just died. This happened every time. One of the most notable apparitions that I've personally seen was a man with a cane that is seen wandering the halls at night. People admitted to the hospital would often report tapping sounds and seeing an old man's face grinning at them from the hospital door, which all of them had. One lady of about 80 kept telling me that she saw this man's face in the mirror in the bathroom, and that half of his face would look badly beaten and disfigured. There have been reports of a cloaked man praying over the dead bodies of the recently departed. I can remember one incident where I walked into the morgue and I saw a body that was recently pronounced dead and covered. I could have sworn that I saw the fading presence of this monk kneeling over the body for a few seconds, then disappear. I would feel the air in the room be so cold, but after he vanished, it warmed up. Another popular ghost at the hospital was the Grim Reaper. The Reaper was a dark figure that would come through the window at the end of the hallway. He would shut doors, touch you on the shoulder, etc. Late at night, you could feel that someone was there, and you would see a dark figure out of the corner of your eye. As soon as you looked up, he was gone. My favorite story to tell is this. I was helping a woman get her bath early one morning. I was asking her how she slept, how she felt, etc. She told me that she did not get a wink of sleep because of the man's face she saw in the window. She said that she thought it was tree branches, but she got up in the middle of the night and saw that it was a man's face staring at her through the window. This woman was just in the hospital for a kidney infection. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. On third shift, you could hear children giggling and hear them running up and down the halls, but there are no children on the floor. If you went past the operating room at night, it would be locked, but inside, you could hear instruments clanging and things being thrown around. Haunted church stories seem to be popping up frequently lately, and I'm here to say that I have a brief story that will involve just that. There's this Catholic church that I used to constantly clean. This was in Vermont, and the church had to have been built in the late part of the 19th century. Very beautiful windows, looked immaculate. Anyway, I used to work as a janitor cleaning the halls late at night, when I would be the only one there. There were many times when I would hear the organ notes playing repeatedly. I would hear the echoes of human voices speaking together, like whispers, and sometimes even clear words. One night, I was cleaning around the church once again. I was all the way at the end of the church when I heard the organs going off. It wasn't the usual sound either. It sounded monstrous, as if someone was literally stomping on the organs. I looked immediately in the direction of where the organ sounds were coming from, and I could have sworn I saw a cloaked figure at the organ and playing it. It was the typical transparent-looking apparition, and when I walked even closer to get a better look, the figure had seemed to disappear. That was, of course, the worst of what I had witnessed, but there were times where I would see the organ once again playing by itself. I'd see a note or two being pushed down by itself when nobody else was in the room, and it was quiet. Anyway, that's all I have to report. I don't work at this church anymore, I'm happy to say, but I thought it was worth sharing. I wish I could say that this wasn't a real experience, but unfortunately, I can't. At least this will always make for an entertaining read. My name is Shannon. I'll be 18 in 11 days. I live in Georgia, and I'm writing to you because I feel so alone. For as long as I can remember, I've dealt with ghosts. I don't know what they are or what they want from me, but they seem to follow me. For the first 5 years of my life, I lived in a trailer in Mississippi. I can only recall one incident from them because I was so young. I remember it was a beautiful day in spring, and I was sitting on a picnic table in our backyard, making mud pies, when suddenly I heard what I thought to be my mother's voice calling me from the woods. I started to follow it. The closer I got, the further out into the deep woods the voice seemed to go. I almost followed it all the way into the woods, thinking my mother was calling me, but suddenly I heard my mother's real voice calling me from the trailer. I turned and saw her waiting for me next to the picnic table, so I ran back and told her what had happened. She, of course, said that it was my imagination. About 12 years ago, our family moved here to Hiram. Every single night for years, I was terrified to sleep because I saw shadow people. They were like three-dimensional shadows that looked like people. I saw them in my room at night after my parents would put me to bed. When I'd call my parents into the room, they would turn on a light and the shadow people would be gone. They said it was my imagination. Lots of other things have happened, and there have been witnesses to some of the events. The house will shake at times. The doors will open and close on their own. I've seen dolls move on their own. A glass has exploded in my hand for no reason. I know glasses will explode from temperature changes, but there was no change in temperature at all. There was a music box that music would play in other rooms of the house when the music box wasn't around. I've heard footsteps when no one was home or awake. I've heard voices. The list goes on. I thought maybe that there was something wrong with me, so I went to a psychiatrist. She said that there's nothing wrong with me. I've learned to verify that I'm really hearing something, because even my cats notice something and hear a lot of things. If they hear it too, their ears perk up. I've tried talking about it before, and they either don't believe me and think I'm making it up, or they think I'm crazy. I really feel alone, and it would be nice if you could give me some sort of guidance. What should I do? Should I do anything? Well,
I apologize for the long email. I'm sure that you get a lot of mail every day, and I hate to add to the pile. Thank you for your time. My name is Luann. I'm 19 years old and live in a little redneck town in Virginia. I live with my grandparents and have lived all my life. My mom was 14 and in the 8th grade. My mom had a very best friend named Wendy, who was 13. They did everything together. Soon after our house was built, Wendy's parents were not getting along and were going through some separation and divorce procedures. Wendy and her mother had moved to Woodbridge, Virginia, soon. During the time of the separation, Wendy spent a great deal at my mom's newly built house. They spent much of their time in my mom's room, which is now my room. Then came the time for Wendy and her mom to move. It was very early one morning. Wendy was in the back of the van, holding a glass coffee table steady. This was in the days before seatbelt laws. There was a drunk driver on the road and hit the van head on. Everyone made it out with semi-serious or minor injuries, but not Wendy. The corner of the glass coffee table hit her in the head and killed her instantly. Years later, in 1985, a week before my mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was in the family room talking to my grandparents about going on birth control. My grandmother and my uncle both caught a glimpse of a girl standing behind my mother, and after that 2-second glimpse, she was gone. My uncle and grandmother agreed that it looked like Wendy. Oh, and she was actually shaking her head when she appeared. We believe that she was shaking her head because she knew my mom was pregnant and didn't want her to go on birth control. Ever since then, everyone in my family has caught a glimpse of her in our house. I usually never get any negative feelings when she materializes, but there was one moment I witnessed her ghost that completely terrified me. I was in the shower. I was home alone, and I had the door completely wide open. It was late evening, and I heard the door to the bathroom slam shut. It startled me so much, so I got dressed and headed out the door. I could have sworn I heard my name being called in a gentle, quiet whisper. It sounded like a little girl. I go downstairs and walk into the living room. And then, I see the lights flickering. I also start to hear the sounds of footsteps walking across our hardwood floors. At this point, I thought I had an intruder in the house. I go to call the police, and after I hang up, I rush upstairs to hide in my bedroom. The thing was, as I was running upstairs, I could have sworn I saw the presence of a little girl, in black, in the corner of my eye as I ran for the stairs. It was only for a couple seconds, and of course, my mind was just thinking about hiding from this intruder. I could have just been seeing things, but I swear, I saw a girl for a second. The police showed up, of course, couldn't find anyone, and all was quiet. My parents came home, and I told them what happened. They were just happy that I was safe. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized it could have been Wendy. Because my room used to be my mom's room, she's in my room most of the time. I feel her presence there a lot. When I'm upset, no matter where I am in the house, I can feel her there. No one has seen her until my mom became pregnant. My family believes that she was sent to watch over her best friend's daughter. This happened to my cousin and I in late '02, in a ranch-style house my family and I used to live in. My cousin woke up in the middle of the night to my voice, or so she thought it was my voice, She looked at me, and I was sound asleep and not talking. Also that night, it was probably 4 or 5 in the morning, and I felt someone pecking on my knee, and it wasn't my cousin because she was sound asleep, so I just thought it was my imagination. As we were eating that morning, my cousin had told me what she had heard. I freaked because I knew that whatever had pecked me on my knee was not my imagination. Nothing was ever actually seen in this house, but a lot of things were felt and heard. A few months after that incident, my cousin was staying the night again. Everyone in the house had been asleep for 2 or 3 hours, but my cousin, she was so addicted to the game The Sims, and she was still on the computer. As she was shutting down the computer, she heard voices coming from the hallway directly to her right. She looked down there and saw nothing. The voices she heard, she knew were not any of ours, so she ran to the floor where she had made her bed and covered her head up. I guess the voices must have stopped after that. A lot of times I would hear cabinets shut, dishes clank together, and other odd unexplainable noises. One night, my brother got home from a friend's house around 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd been asleep on the couch in the living room for at least 4 hours, and my parents had been asleep in their room for about the same amount of time. As my brother got out of his car, he looked towards the door that went directly into the living room from the outside. It had a little window on it. He could see the light from the TV that I always left on at night, but he also saw a black figure looking at him from the inside. He ran in the house and noticed I was on the couch sound asleep. Then he went into my parents' room and asked if they'd been up, and they hadn't. What is scary is that the thing was in the same room with me. The next night, I slept on the couch again. Do not ask me why. My brother was not home yet, and my parents had went to bed. I was watching TV, and I got kind of uneasy, so I laid down and covered up my head. After a while, I heard the glasses in the kitchen sink clanking together. I started to sweat. Then I felt as if someone was coming into the living room, where I was. When my brother arrives home, and the noises stop, I got up and looked at the dishes in the sink, and none of them had been moved. About 14 years ago, we moved into a house that was built in the 1950s. I believe that used to be a boarding house and was right in front of a cemetery. There were lots of noises heard there, and a few spirits as well. I remember staying home one day from school, and my mom was asleep because she worked nights, and I heard a voice say my name. It scared me because we were the only ones home, and it was a voice I had never heard before. My mom would be home during the day by herself, while my brother and I were at school, and she would hear a music box playing. At the time, we had music boxes, but they did not play the song she heard. My mom would be sleeping on the couch, and she would hear footsteps coming through the kitchen, which was right next to the living room where she was. One time, when that happened, she grabbed her shoes and didn't come back till we got out of school. She also would be sleeping in her bed, and it would start shaking. This also happened to me. The shed in this house was directly behind my parents' bedroom, because their bedroom used to be a garage. Well, anyway, my mom would be lying on her bed, and she would hear someone or something walking in there. The odd thing was, it sounded like boots on wood, but the floor in there was concrete. We had a little dog out there at the time, but there was no way it could have sounded like that when it walked. One night, my mom, dad, and brother, we were all sleeping in my room because we put the air conditioner in there in the summer. Well, anyway, it was a cool night, So they had turned the air off and left the door open. My mom for some reason looked at the doorway and felt as if there was a presence there. She just put her face into my dad's back and went to sleep. The next day, she found out that her beloved dad had died, who lived in Kansas, and hadn't been found for a few days. She believes that it was him in the doorway. My brother saw a ghostly head in his bathroom one night. It was in a mist. It was bald on top, with hair around the edges of his head. We believe it was my great-grandpa. This happened at my grandma's house on September 2nd, 2004. It was my grandma's birthday and my mom, my little cousin and I went there to have cake and ice cream. Well, my little cousin decides she wants a Miracle Whip sandwich. She pressed up against the door frame, asking my grandma if she could have a sandwich, when all of a sudden, she looked towards the microwave in the kitchen and screams, drops the jar, and runs to the couch where my grandma is, and my little is crying hysterically. We were all like, what just happened? For some reason, I became very cold and got goosebumps and had the urge to sit up. My little cousin wouldn't tell us what she saw. My grandma tried to tell us it was a mouse or a bug, but I highly doubt it, because she wouldn't have acted like she did. My grandma believes in ghosts, but I think she said that to make herself feel better, because she knew she was going to be there alone when we left. My little cousin, I believe, has forgotten about the incidents, so I did not know what happened. Other things have happened at the grandma's, like something kicked her bed very hardly one night, and she also seen the spirit of a young girl dressed in white one day while lying on her couch in her living room. She's seen a shadow-like figure outside her window, which she knows wasn't a human because her cat started hissing and acting weird, and there's probably been other things that happened that I do not know about. I don't believe I've actually ever seen a spirit, but I know I felt them because in certain places, or sometimes when I talk about the spirits, the back of my neck starts to hurt and feels weird, and sometimes my head will start hurting. I have so many stories to share with you, but I will send them at a later time. My cousin and I were out in Glenpool, towards the boondocks where my grandparents used to live, watching TV late at night. We weren't really tired, hyped up on caffeine from Pepsi and Sprite, just hanging out and trying to see how long we could go without passing out to sleep. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, or my cousin thought I was being a jerk and screwing around. But the louder the sound got, and closer, that's when we both turned the volume down. We then went to turn to each other and ask the same question. Was that you? Did you hear that? Of course, it was like a scratching, shuffling sound outside, and we both dismissed it, thinking that perhaps it was the family pets or wild animal, since the house was out in the middle of nowhere. Instead, curiosity got the better of us. I suggested that maybe it was a ghost, and she promptly crawled towards the window for a peek. She didn't say anything, standing still, like if she moved something would see her. I started to talk, but she silenced me with the wave of her hand. When I got over to the glass, I stared off into the black yard, expecting to see a deer or something. Instead, what I saw was a thing. Best word used to describe it. It was all black, nearly invisible in the shadows it clung to. The only way we were able to see it all was due to a distant light pole. It was skirting around. I guess the dogs must have felt the tension in the air, because at that moment, they all went into wild barks at this intruder. It swung its head, or what seemed like a head, towards the sound of the barks, then up to the window we both watched it from. There was nothing there, no face, nothing at all. Needless to say, both of us were terrified to see a hooded, faceless figure staring back at us. It disappeared, melting into the shadows. The dogs yipped, dashing for cover. Both me and my cousin were cold, shocked, afraid, and speechless. We don't know what it was looking for in our yard, or what it was at all. I used to believe it was a person thinking of robbing our house, or at least I tell myself that so I don't get freaked. Though the truth seems a lot creepier, it is still the truth, and neither I nor my cousin can deny that. When I was 11 years old, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to hear the sound of my dad plowing our driveway. He soon left for work, and I couldn't fall back asleep. After all was quiet, I got out of my bunk bed and climbed down my stairs and walked into the hallway. I went to the bathroom and then back to my room. I climbed into bed and crawled over towards my pillow. It was then that I turned around and was about to pull my blankets over me when I noticed two bright green lights in the corner of my room, directly in front of me. They were glowing and hovering in the same spot I just walked through. I was confused and tried to think of all the possible things they could be. Smoke alarm light? Glow-in-the-dark plastic stars? Anything? I started to get more scared as the time passed, because I tried to eliminate the fact that it could be a spirit. I tried to figure out if it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Perhaps I saw the lights from a clock, and my eyes just needed to adjust to the darkness. I didn't turn any lights on while I got up. I blinked my eyes in a different spot on my wall, and tried to see if the lights would follow my eyes. They didn't. At this point, I looked back to the spot and there they were. I was so scared. They were eyes, and they were staring at me. I was terrified. I couldn't move at all. I was laying down resting on my elbows, just staring at them. They moved forward a foot or so, very slowly. Then, they moved back, and just as slowly, vanished to the left through my wall. I was so scared they would come back, and that's the end of the story. Riverdale Road has a lot more than just that certain place by 132nd. Riverdale Road is spooky throughout the entire road. It's weird. Sometimes the road stretches and shrinks. The bad side of the road actually starts on 104th, North Glen, and goes all the way to the end of the Highway 7, Boulder. But anyway, from 104th to Highway 7 is approximately 13 to 15 miles. I was paying attention to the mileage, and I was going about 35 to 40 the entire time. I started at 104th, and by the time I got to Highway 7, I had only gone 9 miles when I turned around to go back the other way towards 104th again. When I got there, I went 16 miles. Now tell me that isn't creepy. If you pay real close attention to the road, you could almost see it stretching. There's also this turn called Dead Man's Curve. It's a real sharp turn. The recommended speed is 25, but easily done at 40. There's a cement block wall bordering one side of the turn. If you turn that corner around 2:30 a.m., you will see a woman in the middle of the road, holding her hands up, waving for you to stop. When I went around that corner, I didn't have time to stop because she's right there after you do a half 90-degree turn. I ended up hitting her. I got out of my car and looked all around. Absolutely no one was around, but there were handprints on the hood of the car. Also, If you turn onto Riverdale from 112th and turn left, there will be a huge line of trees on the either side, and it just looks like a dark cave of trees. And there's a very mean jogger spirit that hitchhikes and jogs around there. My sister and I were driving around on that road and went through that little cave of trees, and she said she first got a glimpse of the light on his shoes on the left side going away from 104th, and as you get closer you can see that it's a person, and he was holding out his hands for hitchhiking. Then all of a sudden knelt down in the running position, and as soon as we got close enough, he jetted out in front of us. My sister said that there were bodily fluids and body parts all over on the windshield, and she blinked, and it was all gone. She said as soon as he knelt down getting ready to run, she saw that his face was just a skull, and his hand was bones. So yeah, it's not just that spot right by 132nd. There are millions of ghost and spirit stories for that road, believe me. I've gone up and down that road billions of times. I used to do it about 5 to 7 times a day for about a year, so I know that road pretty well. I moved to Overland Park, Kansas, during my 6th grade year, along with my brother, stepfather, and brother. The 5-story house we lived in was in a new neighborhood, and I never took the time to research the land on which our neighborhood was built. Of course, I didn't know what experiences I would find myself in throughout the next few years. My night's routine consisted mostly of sitting in the sunroom on the 4th floor that looked towards the hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a linen closet, and the staircase which led to the master bedroom, while reading whatever book I had at hand. I can't recall how long it had been since my family and I moved into the house. However, I remember this night clearly. My parents went out to eat, and I stayed behind, at home. I was curled into the corner of a sofa that sat in front of a set of windows, reading Guardian by John Saul. The first incident happened well after the night sky had darkened. I was concentrating heavily on my book when I began to hear a knocking coming from outside. It sounded almost exactly like someone hammering on the side of the house. Looking up from my book, I turned and looked outside to see who could be outside at such a time. However, I couldn't see anyone, so I turned around and made myself comfortable to engross myself in my book. Again, the banging continued, and the most effort I put into looking out the window again was angling my head and looking out of the corner of my eye. After a few minutes, the sound outside stopped, only to begin inside. This time, it sounded as someone was banging a hammer on the pipe in the basement, 3 floors below. The banging was 4 or 5 short clangs, and then silence. I'd raised my book again until I was interrupted by another round of clangs. The only thing I could do was try my best to ignore it. As I continued to read, I experienced this unnerving feeling of being watched. I tried to reposition myself on the couch, shifting my legs from underneath me and stretching out, but nothing would unshake the presence. I finally settled on propping my feet on the table and resting the book on my knees. It was then where I could see in my peripheral vision a man standing on the top step of the staircase leading to my parents' bedroom. He stood in complete black, perfectly still, and watched. When I looked directly at him, he disappeared. I figured all the noises and the man I saw were a result of reading the book, and because of this conclusion, I refused to look up at the staircase again, regardless of the fact that the man was still there. I never spoke of the clanging or the man once my parents came home, because I figured it was my imagination. My parents were arguing when they came home anyway, so I tried my best not to get in their way. Most of my time was spent in my room when there were others in the house. You could blame it on adolescence and wanting to be by myself. It was there in my room where another strange incident occurred. I had my radio cranked to the highest decibel and was rocking out when I heard a knock on my door. Turning down the radio, I rushed to the door and opened it to find no one standing outside. I shrugged, thinking I was hearing noises due to the loud radio, closed the door, and cranked the radio back up again. A few minutes later, I heard the knocking again, but this time, instead of turning down the radio, I opened the door while the radio blared. Again, no one stood at my door. I walked into the bathroom, which was immediately to my right, and checked behind the drawn shower curtain because my mother would love to hide and jump out behind me as I walked down the hallway. Well, she wasn't going to get me this time, only she wasn't behind the curtain. I walked down the entire hallway, checking the kitchen and bedrooms before going to my parents' bedroom. It, too, was empty, so I hightailed it to my bedroom, shut the door, and sat on my bed. I figured whoever wanted to come in would, so I no longer answered the knocks. Whoever it was knocked twice more and then stopped. Months passed, and the knockings continued, and the man stood on the top step of the staircase. After a while, I became so used to it, but I never mentioned it to anyone in my house. I always figured it was my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, the sounds and the man disappeared, and I never experienced them again until years later. My mother and I were standing on the back porch one night while she smoked a cigarette. No one was allowed to smoke inside because my younger brother was asthmatic. While she smoked, she mentioned, "I see people in this house." I casually looked at her and replied, "You too?" I can't remember the look on her face, but the sound of her voice distinguished her fear. She told me that she continuously saw 3 people standing on the staircase leading to her bedroom. Only the people she saw were dressed in white. She said that the people she saw stood on the stairs day and night, whereas the person I saw was dressed in black and only stood at the top of the stairs at night. She told me of a night when she was smoking in the garage, and she heard a knocking on the door. Figuring it was her husband, she knocked back in return. Moments later, another knock, and she returned it, and again, until the door opened, and her husband asked why she was knocking on the door. Her answer was, "Because you were knocking." He informed her that he had been downstairs watching television. A year or so after I shared our experiences, my mother and brother, and me, of course, moved out of the house and into an apartment across the street from the neighborhood. My mother and her husband were separated, but he continuously stayed at our apartment anyway. One night, my mother decided to drive back to the house to feed our dog that we left behind at the house, while my stepfather was inside our apartment sleeping. I remained behind as well, sitting outside on the back patio. My mother was gone for 10 or 15 minutes before rushing back through the front door. The hairs on her arm were standing on edge, and she couldn't seem to collect her thoughts. She finally asked, "Do you think I'm crazy?" I laughed and asked why. She explained. While the dog was eating out in the garage, she had gone inside to close the blinds in the formal living room. While her back was the rest of the room, she heard a distant voice saying, "Get out of the house." She said she shook it off and walked up to the sunroom to close more blinds, where she again heard, "Get out of the house." Finally, while closing the blinds in the kitchen, she said that the voice was so close that she ran out of the house without closing the remaining blinds, jerked the dog into the garage, and sped back to the apartment. A year later, we moved to Georgia, where there have been no experiences in any of the houses we've resided in. I've been debating with myself as to why she and I would see people standing on the same staircase, and if their different clothing represented anything. Maybe because that's where most of my parents' fights would take place, or what was trying to get our attention by knocking on the walls. What I do know is that now that my mother is no longer married to the same man, we haven't experienced anything of the like since. Hey guys, really quick, if you could share, subscribe, and like the video, I'd really appreciate it. So guys, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Love you.